Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. Growing up, my brother Cole and I spent almost every summer camping near Big Lake in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest. It was Dad's favorite spot, somewhere quiet enough to lose yourself but familiar enough to feel safe. Even now, years after Dad had passed, I could still recall the faint scent of pine and trout, the feeling of cold lake water on sunburned skin, and nights spent counting stars under the vast Arizona sky. The memories were precious, untouched by the darkness that would later consume them. But things change. Life has a way of twisting even the good memories into something else, something unrecognizable. Cole's recent divorce had turned him bitter, restless and desperate for something familiar. The legal battles had drained him financially and emotionally, leaving him hollow-eyed and withdrawn. "It's time we went back," Cole insisted one cold November morning, showing up at my apartment before dawn. "Clear our heads like the old days." His hands shook slightly as he spoke, whether from caffeine or something deeper, I couldn't tell. I didn't want to go, not really. November at that elevation was brutal, unforgiving. But he needed this trip, and deep down, watching my brother fall apart over the past 6 months, maybe I did too. We loaded Dad's old Tacoma. The paint faded and chipped, the wheel wells rusted through with camping gear that hadn't been used in over a decade. The sleeping bags smelled of mothballs and mildew. The tent poles were bent in places they shouldn't be. None of it felt right, but Cole was already pulling out of the driveway, leaving Phoenix's warmth behind for the high-elevation chill near Big Lake, his jaw set with grim determination. At 9,000 feet in November, everything felt emptier, quieter, wrong. It was late autumn, the leaves long gone from the aspens, and frost glittered like tiny blades of glass in the morning sun. The temperature had dropped to barely 20 degrees as we climbed the winding forest road, our breath fogging the windshield despite the struggling heater. The forest pressed in on both sides, dense and watching. The lake itself was barely recognizable when we finally arrived. What should have been acres of pristine mountain water was now mostly dry. Nothing but cracked mud and gray dirt spreading out like an empty crater, a wound in the earth that hadn't healed. Only a small stagnant pool remained at the northern edge, a sad reminder of what had been. The smell hit us first, dead fish and rotting vegetation, sweet and sickening. "Drought got worse than I thought," Cole muttered, staring at the desolate landscape. His disappointment was visible, the fantasy he'd built up in his mind crumbling against reality. Cole parked above the lake bed on a rough dirt trail that probably hadn't seen vehicle traffic in months. Deep ruts threatened to bottom out the truck's suspension. We set up camp beneath a cluster of tall aspens that rattled dryly in the wind, their white bark peeling in long strips exposing dark wood underneath that looked almost like claw marks. "This isn't exactly what I remembered," Cole said quietly, kicking a chunk of dried mud that crumbled to dust. The sound echoed strangely across the empty lake bed. "Seasons change," I replied, watching him carefully. His eyes had a distant quality, like he was seeing something beyond the trees that I couldn't. We built a small fire as evening approached, struggling with damp wood that produced more smoke than flame. The sky shifted from pale blue to deep purple to an almost black darkness that seemed to swallow the stars. It was brutally cold once the sun dropped behind the ridge, and our breath turned to fog between us, hanging in the still air long after we'd exhaled. The crackling fire did little to ease the bitter chill that settled into my bones, making my joints ache. After a quiet meal of canned soup that tasted like metal, we retreated to our tents. I lay awake for hours, listening to the strange sounds of the forest branches breaking with no wind, distant rustling that moved in circles around our camp, and once what might have been footsteps crunching through frost. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were fragmented and disturbing, filled with images of empty eye sockets and hands reaching up through cracked earth. The next morning, I woke to frost coating the tent flaps, turning the nylon fabric stiff and brittle. My sleeping bag was damp with condensed breath. Cole was already moving around outside, impatiently urging me to hurry up, his voice carrying an edge I didn't recognize. By mid-morning, we started toward the ridge he'd mentioned the night before, each step crunching through half-frozen earth and scattered pine needles that released a sharp, almost medicinal smell when crushed. I fell behind Cole slightly, lost in thought about how different everything looked. When my foot hit something hard, almost twisting my ankle, pain shot up my leg. I looked down expecting to see a rock or tree root, but instead saw bleached white bones partially covered by fallen leaves. Deer bones, I thought at first. My stomach tightened as I looked closer. They weren't scattered naturally. They were stacked neatly, deliberately arranged in a pattern that no animal could manage, no predator would create. Ribs laid out like a small cage, perfectly spaced. A skull resting neatly at its center, positioned upright, facing our camp. The empty eye sockets seemed to stare directly at me. Smaller bones, vertebrae, I thought, formed a circle around the structure. The ground beneath was cleared of all debris, swept clean. "Cole," I called, my voice coming out thin and uncertain. "Come see this." I couldn't take my eyes off the arrangement, couldn't shake the feeling that someone had spent hours creating this, had done it recently, maybe even last night while we slept. He jogged back, his boots loud on the frozen ground, then stopped short. His face went pale as he examined the bones, reaching out but not quite touching them. "Probably some hunter with too much time," he said, but his voice lacked conviction, or bored teenagers. I nodded slowly, trying to accept the simple explanation. "Yeah, probably." But we were miles from anywhere. The nearest town was 40 minutes down a dirt road that became impassable in winter. Who would come up here just to stack bones? We moved forward again, but the sight lingered in the back of my mind, a silent question nagging me. The arrangement was too precise, too deliberate, and there had been no tracks in the frost around it, no footprints at all, as if whoever created it had floated there. Back at camp that evening, as the sky turned from gray to black with frightening speed, we busied ourselves making dinner, sharing strained small talk about sports and weather, anything but the bones. Cole kept staring off into the forest, his head tilting slightly as if listening to something I couldn't hear. The shadows between the trees seemed darker than they should be, more solid. Then a sudden scream pierced the air. Distant yet undeniably human. A woman's voice, raw and terrified, cutting through the stillness like a knife. The sound raised every hair on my body. We both froze, eyes locked, listening intently. My heart hammered against my ribs. It came again, clearer this time, closer. Not words, just pure terror, vocalized. The scream seemed to move, circling around our camp in a wide arc. No echo, despite the rocky terrain that should have bounced the sound back to us. Cole stood abruptly, grabbing his flashlight with trembling hands. "Someone's out there. We should go help." "Wait," I said, gripping his arm hard enough to bruise. "There's no one else up here. We haven't seen anyone. No tire tracks on the road, no other camps." The scream echoed again, but this time it sounded wrong somehow. Too perfect, like a recording played back. It faded deeper into the trees, growing impossibly distant in just seconds. Cole hesitated, conflicted, then shook off my hand roughly. "What if she's hurt? We can't just sit here." There was something desperate in his eyes, almost pleading. I watched helplessly as he disappeared into the woods, his flashlight beam swallowing by darkness within moments. The forest seemed to close behind him like a mouth shutting. I stood alone by the fire, straining to hear his footsteps, but there was nothing. Complete silence. Even the wind had stopped. Minutes dragged into an hour. I paced the perimeter of camp, ears straining for any sound. Branches breaking. Footsteps. Cole's voice. Nothing. The fire crackled and popped, and I jumped at each sound. The darkness beyond the firelight felt alive, pressing in, watching. When Cole finally reappeared, stepping into the firelight so suddenly I yelped. He was pale and out of breath. His pupils dilated wide. Sweat froze in his hair despite the cold. "Couldn't find anything," he said quietly, avoiding my eyes. "Nothing at all. No tracks, no signs of anyone."
What about the screaming?
Stopped. He dropped into his tent without another word, zipping it shut with shaking hands. I followed suit, heart racing, unable to shake the sense that something about him had changed in that hour. Something in the way he moved, in the set of his shoulders. I lay awake, watching the tent fabric move with my breath, listening. Every rustle, every snapping twig jolted my nerves. I knew animals, knew their sounds, their calls, had grown up hunting with Dad. Whatever screamed out there wasn't wildlife. It was something else entirely, something mimicking human distress with unnatural perfection. I woke early to the sound of absolute silence, more complete than any I'd experienced before. Not even wind, not even the distant call of ravens. My breath was visible inside the tent, crystallized by the freezing air that had somehow seeped through every gap in the fabric. A creeping dread settled into my bones even before I realized Cole was missing. His sleeping bag lay empty, twisted open, thrown aside violently. The zipper was wide apart as if he'd gotten out quickly, urgently. His boots sat untouched beside the tent flap, frost crusted on the laces. His heavy jacket was still hanging from a low branch, frost clinging to the sleeves, stiff and frozen. "Cole?" I called out softly at first, then louder, my voice cracking. "Cole, where are you?" The only reply was silence. Absolute smothering silence that pressed against my eardrums. Stepping outside barefoot, I winced at the chill biting into my toes, the frost burning like fire. The morning sun barely reached our campsite through the dense tree cover, leaving a gray twilight across the frozen lake bed that stretched out like a lunar landscape. Something wasn't right. Cole wouldn't leave without boots or a coat, not in this weather, not voluntarily. My heart sped up, adrenaline overcoming the cold numbness in my feet. I quickly dressed, pulling on extra layers with shaking hands, and started searching around camp for footprints. Any sign of which direction he'd gone. There were none. Just a thin, undisturbed layer of frost and snow dusting the ground, pristine and unmarked. That didn't make sense. Even a squirrel would leave tracks here. Even a bird landing would disturb the surface. But there was nothing, as if Cole had simply vanished into thin air or floated away. For hours, I circled the campsite in ever-widening loops, calling Cole's name until my throat burned raw and my voice gave out. The more I searched, the more desperate I became, stumbling over roots and rocks I couldn't see clearly. The eerie quiet only heightened the growing anxiety in my chest, making it hard to breathe. By mid-afternoon, I had covered every possible path twice, each sweep ending with no sign of Cole. The forest felt oppressive around me, looming trees casting dark shadows that crept slowly across the ground as the sun moved. I noticed things I hadn't before. More bone arrangements, smaller ones, hidden in the underbrush. Strange marks carved into tree bark at regular intervals, symbols I didn't recognize but that filled me with inexplicable dread. Just as panic began overwhelming reason, threatening to send me running blindly through the forest, a faint rustling broke through the silence. I spun around, heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst, and there stood Cole. But something was wrong. He was pale, almost gray, his skin waxy and strange in the dim light. His face was expressionless, blank as a mask. He walked stiffly from the direction of the ridge, his movements mechanical, like a puppet on strings. He wore only his thermal pants and long-sleeve undershirt, his feet bare and bloody from walking through the frozen forest. His hands were stained dark red with dried blood that had crusted under his fingernails and in the creases of his palms. "Dear God, Cole, where were you?" I rushed toward him, stopping short at the sight of the blood covering his hands, his wrists, soaked into his sleeves. What happened? He stared at me blankly, as if I was a stranger, as if he'd never seen me before in his life. His eyes were different, the pupils too large, the irises a shade darker than they should be. He looked down at his hands slowly, with detached curiosity, like they belonged to someone else. "I don't know," he murmured, his voice flat and monotone. "Are you hurt?" I reached out cautiously, grabbing his wrist to inspect him, feeling for wounds. His skin was ice cold, far colder than exposure alone could explain. But there were no injuries, no cuts at all, just blood, dried and flaking, someone else's blood. "Cole, whose blood is this?" "I don't know." He repeated the words exactly as before, same inflection, like a recording. "Where were you?" His eyes remained unfocused, staring through me rather than at me. Then slowly, mechanically, he turned his head toward the ridge. I woke up near the rock pile. That's all I remember. My blood went cold. The bones? The deer bones? He nodded slightly, once. Then his gaze sharpened suddenly, focusing somewhere behind me, into the woods. His pupils contracted to pinpoints. "Maybe," he whispered, his breath visible in the cold air. "Let's get you warmed up," I said urgently, my voice shaking, guiding him roughly toward the fire pit. He stumbled slightly, unsteady on his feet like a newborn calf, but said nothing else. I managed to build up the fire with shaking hands, adding wood frantically, watching Cole closely. His silence disturbed me more than his disappearance, more than the blood. Cole was never quiet. He joked, talked endlessly, tried filling any gap with noise and stories. This Cole felt wrong, felt like something wearing my brother's face. I sat across from him, the fire crackling between us, throwing dancing shadows across his blank features. You really don't remember anything? No. He kept his gaze fixed on the flames, unblinking. His voice was distant, almost dreamy. You've got blood on your hands, Cole. That's not nothing. You had to have done something out there, hurt something. My patience frayed, fear sharpening my words into accusations. He looked up sharply, sudden anger flaring in those wrong eyes. I told you, Tyler, I don't know. The way he said my name sounded strange, the syllables slightly wrong. Later, as darkness seeped into the sky like spilled ink, Cole retreated to the tent, collapsing into sleep almost instantly, falling onto the sleeping bag like his strings had been cut. I stayed awake, feeding the fire obsessively, listening carefully to every rustle and snap of branches around us. Cole began muttering in his sleep around midnight. Low, fragmented words I couldn't quite catch. Almost like another language, harsh syllables twisted together in combinations that hurt to hear. The sounds were guttural, wrong, not any language I'd ever heard. It didn't sound like my brother. It didn't sound human. The firelight flickered strangely, and shadows stretched across the ground in ways that defied the fire's position. My hand stayed wrapped tight around the hatchet handle all night, knuckles white, waiting. I didn't dare close my eyes. Something had happened to Cole out there. Something he couldn't or wouldn't share. The blood, the missing hours, the unnatural quiet around camp. It all felt connected, pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to complete. As dawn approached, exhaustion tugged at me, my eyelids growing heavy despite my fear, but I jolted fully awake at the crunch of frozen earth. Cole was outside the tent again, standing barefoot and shirtless in the freezing dawn, his breath not fogging the air like mine did. He stood perfectly still, staring toward the ridge, his back rigid, arms hanging at his sides. Cole, get back inside. I scrambled up, panic flooding through me. But he didn't move, didn't acknowledge me at all. He just stood there, muscles tensed under his skin, eyes fixed on something beyond the trees. I followed his gaze, my breath hitching painfully when I saw it. A dark, hunched figure crouched low on a distant boulder, perfectly still, watching us. It was man-shaped but wrong somehow. The proportions off, the limbs too long, the way it held itself unnatural. Even from this distance I could feel its attention, its focus, like physical pressure against my skin.
Cole, do you see that?
I hissed urgently, fear closing my throat. He didn't reply, didn't even blink. His chest rose and fell slowly, mechanically. Then the figure was gone, slipping into the shadows beneath the trees with impossible speed. There one moment and vanished the next. No sound, no disturbance of branches. Anger overtook my fear, frustration bubbling up from somewhere deep and desperate. I grabbed Cole roughly by the shoulder, spinning him toward me. His skin was like ice. What the hell happened to you out there? He shoved me violently, with strength he shouldn't have had, strength that sent me stumbling back several feet. Don't touch me, he growled. His voice was low and guttural, unrecognizable, coming from somewhere deep in his chest. Panic surged through me, instinct overpowering hesitation. We're leaving. Now. We're getting off this mountain. No, Cole shouted, his voice cracking in panic, in genuine terror. His eyes went wide, pupils dilating. You can't. It watches when you speak of it. What watches? I demanded, grabbing his shoulders hard, shaking him. What are you talking about? He twisted in my grip violently, his eyes wild and terrified, showing whites all around. You don't understand. We disturbed something. The bones, they weren't just bones. They were markers, warnings. I don't care, I shouted back. We're leaving. He shoved me again, harder, and I stumbled backward over the fire ring. My hand found a thick fallen branch, gripping it tightly. Cole lunged toward me again, his hands reaching for my throat, fury, and something else, something desperate, distorting his features. I swung instinctively. The branch cracked against his knee with a sickening sound, and he dropped instantly, crying out in pain. The sound was human again, blessedly human. My stomach churned, guilt colliding with survival instinct. "I'm sorry, Cole. I'm so sorry." My voice broke as I looked at him writhing on the ground, but I couldn't stop. I bound his legs tightly with paracord, then his hands, lifted him into the truck bed with strength I didn't know I had, and threw our gear in haphazardly. His eyes never left me, filled with hatred and something else, something darker I couldn't name and didn't want to understand. I drove fast, too fast for the rutted dirt road, headlights cutting sharply through the trees, desperate to reach civilization before dark. Cole remained in the truck bed, silent and unmoving, staring up at the sky with that blank expression. But I knew with terrible certainty that the thing from the ridge was following us. I could feel it in the rearview mirror, just beyond what the headlights illuminated, keeping pace with impossible ease. 2 days later, Cole opened his eyes in an urgent care clinic in Springerville. He stared at me blankly, confusion clouding his expression. Outside the window, sunlight warmed the white walls of the small-town clinic, creating an unsettling contrast to the dark, cold woods we'd left behind. "What happened?" Cole asked softly, his voice his own again, shifting uncomfortably on the stiff clinic bed. "Tyler? You don't remember." It wasn't a question. He shook his head slowly, genuine bewilderment in his eyes. They were the right color again, the right size. "We went camping, right? Why am I here? Why does my knee hurt so badly?" I hesitated, words caught in my throat. How could I explain the missing hours, the blood on his hands, the thing on the ridge? "You disappeared," I finally said, choosing my words carefully. "I found you hours later. You were disoriented, not yourself." He frowned deeply, glancing down at his bandaged knee, then back at me with growing fear. "Did I hurt someone?" "I don't know." A nurse stepped in quietly, interrupting before Cole could question further. She checked his vitals, scribbled notes, and gave me a look that implied I shouldn't push him too hard. Cole drifted back into sleep, leaving me alone in the quiet room, haunted by questions I couldn't answer. Later, 2 forest rangers arrived to speak with me in the waiting room. They were polite, cautious, but their questions probed it deeply, professionally. "Can you tell us exactly where you camped?" asked the older one, his weathered face serious. "Above Big Lake," I said vaguely, uneasy under their scrutiny. "We grew up camping there, wanted to revisit old memories." The younger ranger studied me carefully. "Did you notice anything unusual out there? Any other campers? Strange activities?" My throat tightened, the memory of stacked deer bones vivid in my mind, Cole's empty stare, the distorted figure on the ridge. I opened my mouth, then closed it. "No," I lied. "It was quiet. Just us." The older ranger exchanged a glance with his partner, something unspoken passing between them, something that said they didn't quite believe me but wouldn't push further. After a few more formal questions about Cole's condition and our planned departure date, they left me alone. I sat for a long time, hands shaking, unsure why I'd hidden the truth. Perhaps I feared what acknowledging it might mean. Perhaps I feared they'd think I was insane. Or perhaps deep down, I knew that speaking of it would draw its attention again. Days later, I drove Cole back to his apartment in Phoenix. He didn't say much, lost in thought, staring vacantly out the passenger window at the desert landscape sliding past. We never returned to the topic of the woods, as if an unspoken agreement had settled between us, one born of confusion and fear, and something older, something that told us silence was survival. Over the next weeks, my attempts at normal life crumbled. Sleep became impossible, my nights riddled with nightmares of those woods and that figure. One night, after waking drenched in sweat, sheet soaked, I turned on my computer and searched desperately for explanations. Hours passed, my eyes aching from the screen's glow, until I stumbled upon accounts from other campers in that same area. Stories eerily similar to ours. Disappearances, strange behaviors, people who came back wrong. The accounts spoke of something ancient in those mountains. Something that had been there long before the forest grew. Before the lake filled with water. Something that marked its territory with bones, and waited patiently for those who ignored the warnings. Closing the laptop sharply, I stared into the darkness of my room, heart racing with terrible certainty. Something had found us at Big Lake. Something old and patient and hungry. Within days, I burned our camping gear in a barrel behind my apartment complex, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed us back, that it clung to the fabric and canvas. The old Tacoma, the truck Dad had loved more than any possession, I sold to a scrapyard in Tucson for a fraction of its value, desperate to sever all connections to that trip. Months passed. Cole stayed clear of wilderness entirely, refusing even to drive near mountain roads. He moved to San Diego, exchanging Arizona's deserts and forests for a busy city by the ocean, distancing himself from everything familiar. I relocated to Oregon, seeking cooler, greener landscapes, hoping to replace the shadowed woods of Apache Sitgreaves with something brighter, safer, wetter. We talked occasionally, brief phone calls that felt hollow, cautious, each of us careful not to trigger memories of those lost hours, dancing around the subject that defined us now. But one late winter afternoon, 6 months after our trip, something broke the silence between us. Cole called, sounding shaken, his breath rapid and panicked. "Tyler, it's happening again." "What do you mean?" My heart sank. "I keep waking up outside," he whispered, his voice ragged with exhaustion and fear. "Barefoot, in parking lots, on the beach, in my apartment complex courtyard. I don't remember getting there, but I'm always facing east, always, toward Arizona, toward the lake." Fear tightened my chest, old memories flooding back with visceral intensity. "Cole, listen to me. Don't think about it. Don't talk about it. Try to forget. Just try." He laughed bitterly, a sound close to sobbing. "I can't forget, Tyler. Something happened to me there. Something still inside my head, still watching through my eyes." "Then come here," I urged desperately. "Stay with me. We'll figure this out together." He didn't respond right away. The silence stretched, filled only with his ragged breathing. Then softly, almost too quiet to hear, "I'm not sure it's safe for you. I think it follows me, Tyler. I think it's always following me." The line went dead. Days later, a small postcard arrived at my Oregon address, forwarded from my old Phoenix apartment. No return label, no postmark, just a single brightly colored image of Big Lake in summer, water sparkling blue under perfect skies, a scene that no longer existed. My hands trembled as I flipped it over, reading a simple message scribbled in familiar jagged handwriting that hadn't changed since Cole and I were children. "Still watching. Still listening. It knows your name now, too." I called Cole immediately, fingers fumbling with the phone, angry and terrified. "Why would you send this? What kind of sick joke?" "Send what?" He sounded confused, anxious, genuinely bewildered. "Tyler, what postcard? I didn't send you anything." In that instant, cold certainty settled in my stomach like a stone. Cole hadn't sent it. Whatever we'd found in those woods, or whatever had found us, had never left. It was patient. It was watching. And now it knew both our names, knew where we lived, knew we couldn't forget no matter how hard we tried. The postcard sits on my desk now, that impossible image of Big Lake mocking me. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear screaming in the distance, raw, terrified human. And sometimes, when I wake in the dark, I'm standing at my window, barefoot, staring east toward Arizona, toward a dry lake bed and a ridge where something waits. It's patient. It can wait forever. And deep down, I know that one day, whether in months or years, Cole and I will go back. Not because we want to, but because it's calling us home. My buddy Tyler and I have maintained a sacred ritual since our high school days. An annual camping trip to the Ozarks every autumn. These weren't casual weekend getaways to groomed campgrounds with shower facilities and nearby convenience stores. We sought something primal, something that stripped away the veneer of civilization and reconnected us with the raw essence of survival. Fishing in pristine waters untouched by commercial pollution, hiking trails that existed only because deer and other animals had worn them into the earth over centuries, and hunting game that had never heard a vehicle's engine or seen a paved road. 5 years ago, we planned what we thought would be another memorable excursion. We chose early November, when the temperature would hover just above freezing at night, when the leaves had mostly fallen and the forest revealed its skeletal architecture. The week before departure, we meticulously organized our supplies with the thoroughness of men who understood that forgetting a single essential item could transform an adventure into a crisis. Tents, sleeping bags rated for sub-zero temperatures, a cooler packed with ice, non-perishable food that wouldn't spoil if the ice melted, our hunting rifles that we'd cleaned and oiled the previous weekend, boxes of ammunition, waterproof matches, a first aid kit, water purification tablets, topographical maps, and a compass, because we never trusted GPS devices in areas where cell towers were nothing but distant rumors. We preferred camping deep in the backwoods, miles from the nearest maintained trail, because crowds destroyed the illusion. When you could hear other campers laughing, or smell their cooking fires, you weren't really in the wilderness. You were just in an outdoor hotel without walls. Tyler and I craved genuine isolation, the kind where your nearest neighbor might be a black bear or a mountain lion, not a family from the suburbs trying to teach their kids how to roast marshmallows. We departed on a Friday morning just after dawn. My truck loaded until the suspension groaned under the weight. The drive took us through increasingly rural areas, from interstate highways to state routes to county roads that appeared on maps but seemed forgotten by anyone responsible for their maintenance. After several hours, we turned onto a series of dirt roads that loggers used maybe twice a year. The canopy above grew denser, filtering the autumn sunlight into a greenish gloom that made it feel later in the day than it actually was. Eventually, we reached an overgrown trailhead that barely qualified as such. Just a slight gap in the wall of vegetation where someone had once walked frequently enough to prevent complete reclamation by the forest. We'd identified this location weeks earlier, spending hours poring over maps, looking for areas far from any marked campgrounds, ranger stations, or even the informal campsites that weekend warriors sometimes established. We shouldered our packs and began the hike. The weight dug into our shoulders immediately, and within minutes sweat soaked through our shirts despite the cool November air. We pushed through dense brush that clawed at our clothes and faces, ducked under low-hanging branches draped with Spanish moss, and forded the creek twice where the trail simply disappeared into the water. Over an hour passed before we reached the clearing we'd selected from satellite imagery, a roughly circular area where some long-ago lightning strike or windstorm had knocked down several large trees, creating an opening in the forest canopy. The location exceeded our expectations. Level ground made pitching tents straightforward. Several fallen logs provided natural seating around a fire pit, and the creek burbled over smooth stones about 50 yards away. Close enough for convenient access to water, but far enough that we wouldn't flood if the weather turned nasty. By the time we'd made multiple trips back to the truck to haul in all our gear, the sun hung low on the horizon, painting the clearing in shades of orange and amber. We worked efficiently, our movements synchronized by years of practice. Within an hour, both tents stood secure. Our sleeping bags were unrolled inside. The cooler sat in the shade of a large oak, and a fire crackled in a ring of stones we'd arranged. We cracked open cold beers, toasting to the weekend ahead, to friendship, to temporary escape from jobs and obligations and the grinding monotony of everyday existence. Tyler grilled thick steaks over the fire while I prepared a cast-iron skillet full of beans and sliced potatoes with onions. The smell of cooking meat and wood smoke filled the clearing, and for those first few hours, everything felt exactly as it should. The temperature dropped as darkness descended, and we pulled on fleece jackets, adding larger pieces of wood to the fire until flames leaped 3 feet high, sending spirals of sparks into the black sky above. The night sounds began as they always did in the wilderness. Coyotes called to each other from distant ridges, their high-pitched yips and howls echoing through the valleys. An owl hooted from somewhere in the darkness beyond our firelight. That distinctive low question repeated at irregular intervals. Insects buzzed and clicked in the underbrush. These were familiar sounds, comforting in their predictability, proof that the forest teemed with life even when you couldn't see it. But then came other sounds. Around midnight, as we sat nursing our third or fourth beers and contemplating turning in, a cry pierced the darkness. Not a howl, not a screech, but something in between. A wailing sound that rose and fell in pitch, almost human, but not quite. It went on for nearly 30 seconds, long enough that Tyler and I exchanged glances across the fire. Long enough that the ordinary night sound ceased, as if every creature in the forest had collectively held its breath. "What the hell was that?" Tyler asked, his voice carrying a forced lightness that didn't quite mask his unease. "Probably just a fox," I said, though I'd heard foxes before and this hadn't sounded like any fox I knew. They can make some pretty weird noises during mating season. In November, I shrugged, tossing another log on the fire. The cry came again, from a different direction this time, closer to our camp. Then it was answered by another cry, farther away. Back and forth they went. These tormented sounds that made my skin crawl and my hands grip my beer bottle with unnecessary force. Tyler joked nervously about skinwalkers and wendigos, laughing a little too loudly at his own humor. And I joined in because the alternative was admitting that something about those cries frightened me on an instinctive level I couldn't quite articulate. Morning arrived, wrapped in thick fog that reduced visibility to maybe 20 feet. Tyler and I gulped down instant coffee that tasted like bitter dirt but delivered the caffeine our bodies craved. We geared up for hunting. Blaze orange vests over our camouflage jackets, rifles loaded and slung over shoulders, ammunition in our pockets, knives on our belts. The dawn had a peculiar quality, mist rising off the creek like steam from a cauldron, individual water droplets suspended in the air and catching the weak sunlight in tiny prismatic flashes. We hiked over a ridge to the north, following game trails marked by deer droppings and tracks in the soft earth. After about 45 minutes, we found a promising area. Recent scrapes on tree trunks where bucks had rubbed their antlers, multiple trails converging near a natural salt lick. We settled in, backs against trees about 30 yards apart, and waited. And waited. 2 hours passed without a single deer sighting. That wasn't unusual in itself. Hunting required patience, and sometimes you could sit all day without seeing your quarry. But other things bothered me. I hadn't seen a squirrel, hadn't heard any birds except for the occasional distant crow. The forest felt empty, abandoned, as if all the animals had evacuated en masse to somewhere safer. "Something's wrong," Tyler finally said, breaking the silence. "Where is everything?" I didn't have an answer. In all our years of camping and hunting, I'd never experienced a forest this quiet, this devoid of life. Even in the dead of winter, you'd see chickadees and juncos, hear woodpeckers hammering on trees, spot the occasional rabbit or opossum. This felt unnatural, as if some predator had moved into the area and everything else had wisely chosen to leave. We gave up by early afternoon, heading back toward camp. That's when Tyler stopped abruptly, pointing at the ground.
Look at that.
Pressed into the mud beside the trail were tracks. Large tracks, maybe 8 or 9 inches long, roughly canine in shape but wrong in their proportions. The claws had dug deep furrows into the soft earth, and the stride between prints suggested something that moved on 2 legs, not 4. I crouched down, examining them more closely. Whatever had made these tracks had been heavy. The impressions went down at least an inch, which meant significant weight. "Bear," Tyler suggested, but his voice carried no conviction. "Bears don't walk on 2 legs for extended distances," I said, measuring the distance between tracks with my hand. "And the print shape is wrong. Too narrow." We followed the tracks for maybe 50 yards. They paralleled our own trail from this morning, sometimes crossing it, sometimes diverging into the underbrush before returning, like something had been following us, tracking our movements with careful attention. We decided to head back to camp early, neither of us voicing the anxiety that had settled like cold stone in our stomachs. The walk back felt different. Every snapping twig made us jump. Every rustle in the underbrush made our hands drift toward our rifles. The fog had burned off by then, but somehow the clear visibility made things worse. Now I could see into the forest, could scan the spaces between trees, and I kept thinking I saw movement that, when I looked directly at it, resolved into nothing but shadows and branches. At camp, we tried to pretend everything was normal. We ate an early dinner of canned stew heated over the fire, made small talk about sports and work, cleaned our rifles even though they didn't need cleaning. But as darkness fell, the pretense collapsed. Neither of us suggested staying up late or having more beers. We both wanted to be in our tents, zipped up tight as if thin nylon fabric could protect us from whatever had made those tracks. I lay in my sleeping bag staring at the tent's ceiling, listening to Tyler moving around in his tent about 10 feet away. The fire outside had burned down to coals, providing minimal light. Every sound seemed amplified. The creeks babbling, wind rustling dead leaves, the settling of the forest as temperatures dropped. Then I heard breathing. Not Tyler's breathing, which I could identify even from a distance, the steady rhythm of someone trying to fall asleep. This was different. Heavy, wet breathing punctuated by occasional snuffling sounds, like an animal following a scent trail. The sounds moved around the perimeter of my tent, and through the mesh window I saw a shape block out the stars. Large, dark, moving on two legs with an uneven gait that seemed more purposeful than any bear's movement. Then the eyes appeared. Two reflective points of yellowish light, catching some faint glow from the dying embers of our fire, positioned about 6 feet off the ground and staring directly at me through the mesh. The breathing stopped. Whatever it was knew I was looking back at it. My throat closed up. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't even think coherently. The eyes didn't blink, didn't shift away. They just stared with an intelligence that felt malevolent, assessing, deciding something about me. The moment stretched impossibly long, maybe 5 seconds, maybe 30. I honestly couldn't tell. Time had stopped meaning anything. "Tyler," I finally managed to croak. "Something's outside." The eyes vanished instantly. I heard rapid footsteps, heavy and loud, crashing away through the underbrush. Tyler erupted from his tent, rifle in hand, swinging it toward the sounds of retreat. "What did you see?" he demanded, his voice high and tight with fear. "I don't know. It was watching me. It was right there, just standing outside my tent." We both stood in the clearing for several minutes, rifles pointed at the darkness, seeing nothing but hearing the occasional crack of a branch from somewhere out in the forest. Always moving, circling our camp at a distance. Finally, Tyler said what we were both thinking. "We need to leave. First light we pack up and get out of here." Neither of us slept. We sat together in Tyler's tent, which had a better vantage point of the clearing, rifles across our laps, jumping at every sound. The hours until dawn crawled by with excruciating slowness. At first light, that gray pre-dawn glow that barely counts as illumination, we began breaking camp. We didn't bother with breakfast, didn't even finish our coffee. Everything got stuffed into packs with frantic speed. Tents collapsed and rolled without proper care. The fire kicked apart and doused with creek water. Within 30 minutes of deciding to leave, we were hiking back toward the trailhead, moving at a pace just short of running. The forest in the early morning felt even more oppressive than it had the previous day. Fog hung in the low areas, transforming familiar landmarks into vague suggestions of shapes. Our boots squelched in muddy patches where dew had accumulated overnight. Our breath came out in visible plumes, and my hands ached with cold despite my gloves. We were maybe halfway back when we encountered the fallen oak. It blocked the trail completely. A massive tree that had somehow toppled since we'd passed through this area 24 hours earlier. The trunk stood nearly 4 feet in diameter, too large to easily climb over while carrying heavy packs. Tyler and I stopped, breathing hard, exchanging glances. The tree looked healthy, green cambium layer visible where branches had snapped off. No signs of disease or rot. Trees didn't just fall over on calm nights. A branch snapped behind us. The sound came from close, maybe 20 yards back on the trail. We spun around, bringing our rifles up to shooting position. It stood between 2 oak trees, partially obscured by low-hanging branches, but clearly visible enough to destroy any remaining doubt about what we were dealing with. 7 feet tall at least, covered in grayish-brown fur that hung in matted clumps from its frame, standing upright on 2 legs that bent backward at the knee like a dog's hind legs. The arms hung long, almost to its knees, ending in hands with fingers tipped by black claws that curved like scythes. But the face, God help me. The face was the worst part. A canine snout filled with too many teeth, lips pulled back in what might have been a snarl or a grin, and those yellow eyes boring into us with unmistakable intelligence. A low growl emanated from its throat. A subsonic rumble I felt in my chest as much as heard with my ears. My finger moved to the trigger. I'd been hunting since I was 12 years old, had taken deer, wild boar, even an elk once on a trip to Colorado. I'd shot hundreds of targets at the range, knew my rifle intimately, could hit a playing card at 50 yards, but my hands trembled so badly I could barely keep the sights on target. I fired. The shot went wide, probably missing by several feet, the crack of the rifle obscenely loud in the misty forest. The thing didn't even flinch. Instead, it bared its fangs further and took a deliberate step toward us. Tyler tried to fire, but his rifle clicked empty. He'd forgotten to chamber a round in his panic. He fumbled with the bolt action, hands shaking, and the creature took another step, then another, closing the distance with terrifying speed. "Move," I screamed, and we both turned and scrambled over the fallen oak, landing hard on the other side. I looked back just in time to see the creature reach the tree trunk. It placed one clawed hand on the bark, and for a moment I thought it would vault over and end us right there. Instead, it just stood there, watching us with those horrible eyes, its lips pulling back further to reveal gums and the roots of those terrible teeth. Then it turned and melted into the forest, disappearing with barely a sound despite its size. We ran. Not the controlled tactical movement of experienced hunters, but pure panicked flight. Our packs bounced painfully against our backs, low branches whipped our faces and grabbed at our clothing, roots tried to trip us with every step. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I couldn't stop. Stopping meant dying. The trail seemed endless, stretching on and on through the foggy forest. I kept thinking we should have reached the trailhead by now. Should be seeing the opening where we'd parked the truck, but every turn revealed more forest, more trail, more distance to cover. And the thing followed us. I'd catch glimpses of it moving through the trees, parallel to our path, matching our pace effortlessly. It wasn't even trying to hide anymore. I'd see its bulky shape between tree trunks, would hear branches breaking as it pushed through underbrush, would sometimes hear that wet, heavy breathing. It was toying with us, letting us think we might escape, feeding on our terror. Tyler tripped over a root and went down hard, landing face first in a patch of mud. I skidded to a stop, turned back to help him up, and found myself staring at the creature. It had somehow gotten behind us, standing maybe 30 feet away, in a small clearing where morning light penetrated the canopy and illuminated it fully. In the better light, I could see details that my mind wanted to reject. The fur was matted with what looked like dried blood. The claws had remnants of tissue stuck under them. Its shoulders and back bore old scars. White lines cut through the fur. Evidence of fights, of violence, of survival through savagery. It breathed through its open mouth, and I saw that the teeth were different lengths, some broken, some worn down to nubs, some sharp as needles. We made eye contact. In that moment I understood that this wasn't some mindless beast acting on instinct. Intelligence looked back at me. Consciousness, awareness. It knew exactly what it was doing to us. It was enjoying our fear, savoring our helplessness. Its breath smelled like rot, like carrion left in the summer sun for days. My whole body locked up, refusing to respond to commands. Tyler managed to get to his feet beside me, and the creature's eyes shifted to him, then back to me, deciding something, weighing options. Then it simply walked away, turning its back on us with contemptuous ease, disappearing into the shadows between trees. The message was clear. It could kill us whenever it wanted. Right now, the chase was more entertaining. I don't remember much about the final stretch of our flight. My mind had retreated to some primitive state where conscious thought ceased and only movement mattered. Keep legs pumping, keep moving forward, don't look back, don't stop, don't think. Tyler ran beside me, his face pale and streaked with mud, his eyes wide and unfocused. When the forest finally opened up and I saw my truck sitting in that small clearing by the old logging road, I nearly wept with relief. We threw our packs in the back, clambered into the cab, and I started the engine with shaking hands. The truck roared to life, and I'd never been more grateful for the sound of an internal combustion engine. I drove like a maniac down that dirt road, the truck bouncing and sliding, branches scraping the paint, rocks pinging off the undercarriage. I didn't slow down until we hit pavement, didn't really breathe normally until we were back on the highway with traffic around us and houses visible through the trees. We stopped at a gas station in the first real town we reached. Tyler went to the bathroom and threw up. I bought 2 bottles of water and drank them both in about 30 seconds, my hands still trembling so badly I could barely unscrew the caps. We didn't talk about what happened. What was there to say? The drive home took hours, but it passed in uncomfortable silence. Every time I closed my eyes, even to blink, I saw those yellow eyes staring back at me. When we finally reached Tyler's house, we unloaded his gear without speaking. Before he went inside, he turned to me and said, "We don't tell anyone. They'll think we're crazy." I nodded. Who would believe us? Who would believe that something like that existed? That it hunted in the deep Ozark forests? That it had tracked us and terrorized us and let us live only because it chose to? In the months after, I spent countless hours researching online. I found forums where people discussed cryptids and unexplained encounters. Some called what we saw a dogman, others referred to something called the Ozark Howler. The descriptions varied, but common threads emerged: bipedal, canine features, aggressive behavior, intelligent hunting tactics found in remote wilderness areas. I read accounts from other people who'd encountered similar creatures. Many of their stories ended the same way ours did, with survival only because the thing allowed it, with a bone-deep certainty that they'd been hunted by something that shouldn't exist but did. Tyler and I haven't spoken much since that trip. Every few months, one of us will call the other, and we'll talk about work or family or sports, carefully avoiding any mention of camping or hunting or the Ozarks. The friendship that sustained us through high school and into adulthood has been fractured by that weekend, broken by the knowledge we share and can't escape. I haven't been camping since. Haven't even left the city limits after dark if I can help it, because I know what's out there in the deep places, in the wild areas where humans rarely venture. I know that we're not the apex predators we like to think we are. I know that some things exist beyond our understanding, beyond our ability to fight or control or even comprehend. And I know that if I ever go back to those woods, the creature that let us leave won't make the same mistake twice. It's still there, somewhere in the remote wilderness of the Ozarks, waiting for the next foolish humans to wander into its territory. I pray to God that I'm never one of them again. The morning mist clung to Pine Ridge Forest like a shroud, and I should have taken that as an omen. My name's on the ranger station door, Chief Park Ranger, but after 15 years patrolling these 50,000 acres of Michigan wilderness, I'd learned to read the forest's moods. Today felt wrong. I was reviewing incident reports when Deputy Sheriff Carter knocked on my door. His usually steady hands trembled as he placed photographs on my desk. Driver's licenses, all smiling faces that would never smile again. That makes 12 missing in 3 months, he said, pointing to the latest additions. Emily Watson, 19. Olivia Chen, 22. Both experienced hikers who knew these trails. I studied the photos spread across my desk like a macabre deck of cards. The missing included families, solo hikers, even a group of college students from the university. Emma Rodriguez had been training for a marathon. Ava Mitchell was an Eagle Scout leader who could navigate by stars. These weren't careless tourists who wandered off marked paths. Any connection between them? I asked, though I suspected the answer. All disappeared on the northern trails, between sections 7 and 12. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle, just gone. Carter's voice cracked. My nephew Zane was supposed to hike those trails last weekend. I told him to stay away. I pulled out the topographic map, marking each disappearance with red pins. The pattern emerged like a disease, all clustered around Devil's Hollow, a depression in the forest floor where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground. Local Ojibwe had warned settlers away from that area for generations, speaking of a creature that walked on 2 legs but hunted like a wolf. We need to organize search parties, I decided. Get volunteers from town. Cover every square inch of Section 7 through 15. 3 days later, we had found exactly nothing. Omar led the first search team, a group of experienced hunters including Knox, Rory, and Marco. They returned shaken, claiming they'd heard howling that didn't sound like any wolf they'd ever encountered. Preston's team found strange tracks, larger than a man's boot, but with claw marks that suggested something inhuman. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Lennon, a local wildlife photographer, had been monitoring a family of black bears near Devil's Hollow. His trail cameras captured something that made my blood freeze. The footage was grainy, shot at 3:17 a.m. by infrared. A figure moved between the trees, tall, easily 7 feet, with a gait that alternated between human and beast. Its head was wrong, elongated like a wolf's snout but positioned upright on human shoulders. The creature paused directly in front of the camera, and for one terrible moment, yellow eyes stared directly into the lens with unmistakable intelligence. "Dog man," whispered Archer, the old-timer who ran the bait shop. He joined our impromptu meeting at the ranger station after word spread about the footage. My grandfather saw one back in '47, said it was punishment for disturbing the old burial grounds. Colin and Seth, local loggers, nodded grimly. "We've been hearing stories our whole lives," Colin said. "Thought it was just talk to keep kids from wandering into the deep forest." But Hugo, our resident skeptic and part-time biology professor, shook his head. There has to be a rational explanation. Maybe it's someone in a costume trying to scare people away from something valuable hidden in those woods. I wanted to believe Hugo's theory, but the evidence suggested something far worse. The tracks we'd found showed unusual wear patterns. The front pads were heavily worn like a quadruped's, but the heel strikes indicated bipedal movement. No human could fake that kind of biological inconsistency. That evening, I walked the perimeter of our search area alone, trying to think like both predator and prey. The missing people had all been healthy adults in good physical condition. Whatever took them had to be incredibly strong and fast to overcome them without leaving signs of struggle. As darkness fell, I heard it. A howl that started low and mournful like a wolf's call, then rose to an almost human scream. It came from deep within Devil's Hollow, and every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run. But 12 people were missing, and their families deserved answers. I radioed back to headquarters. "This is base station. Tomorrow we're going into the Hollow. If something's living in there, we're going to find it." The response came back crackling with static. "Copy that, Chief. Whatever you need." But as I started the long walk back to my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the tree line. The hair on my neck stood up, and I quickened my pace despite myself. Behind me, a branch snapped. I didn't look back. At dawn, our search party assembled at the Devil's Hollow trailhead. I'd handpicked 8 men. Caesar and Troy, both ex-military with combat experience. Finn and Kobe, local hunters who knew the terrain. Reed and Eric, EMTs who could handle whatever we might find. Dylan and Donovan, brothers who'd grown up in these woods. "Remember, we stay together," I addressed the group. "No one goes off alone for any reason. We have radios, but the terrain might interfere with signals. If you see anything unusual, anything at all, you call it out immediately." The trail into Devil's Hollow descended sharply through old-growth pine and oak. The trees here were different. Older, more gnarled, with bark that looked scarred by claw marks. 20 minutes in, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the normal forest sounds faded to an oppressive silence. Cameron found the first sign, a backpack caught on thorns about 15 feet off the trail. The tag identified it as belonging to Sophia Williams, missing for 6 weeks. The pack was torn open, its contents scattered, but what made my stomach clench was the smell, musk and rot, like a wet dog left in a closed car for days. "Predator scent marking," observed Simon, who'd worked as a wildlife biologist before becoming a deputy. "But I've never smelled anything like this. It's almost wrong somehow." We followed a game trail deeper into the hollow, where the canopy grew so thick that we needed flashlights at midday. Clay spotted the next clue. Scratches on tree trunks, 8 feet off the ground, made by claws that would dwarf a grizzly's. "Whatever made these is bigger than anything that should exist in Michigan," Rudy muttered, measuring the gouges with his hunting knife. The trail led us to a clearing where the trees formed an almost perfect circle. The ground was bare except for scattered bones. Some human, some animal, all picked clean. In the center sat a crude shelter made from branches and mud, large enough for something much bigger than a man. Frank and Grant, our most experienced trackers, examined the area while the rest of us formed a defensive perimeter. "Multiple individuals held here," Frank reported grimly. "Based on the clothing scraps and personal items, I'd say at least 6 people. Are they?" I couldn't finish the question. "Some bones are old, some recent. But here's the thing. They weren't killed here. No blood, no signs of violence. It's like they were kept here for a while, then taken somewhere else." That's when Alan spotted the cave entrance, hidden behind a fallen log, and nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. The opening was large enough for a person to crawl through, but the smell that emerged made us all step back, that same musky, rotten odor, but concentrated. "It has to be in there," I said, checking my service weapon. "The missing people, the creature, answers. Everything's in that cave." Albert and Lawrence volunteered to go first, their military training evident in how they moved. The cave mouth led to a tunnel that angled downward into the earth. Our flashlight beams revealed scratch marks on the walls and floor, as if something with claws had been traveling this route for years. The tunnel opened into a natural cavern, and what we found there will haunt me forever. Maurice played his light across makeshift cages built from logs and wire. Prison cells sized for humans. Most were empty, but 3 still contained occupants. Isabella Martinez sat huddled in the corner of one cage, her eyes wide with terror and madness. She'd been missing for 8 weeks, and her hair had gone completely white. Mia Thompson was in worse shape, catatonic and unresponsive to our calls. In the third cage we found Amelia Foster, barely alive but still conscious enough to whisper a warning. "It's coming back. It always comes back at sunset." While Clyde and Floyd worked to free the survivors, Perry and Eugene explored deeper into the cave system. They returned with grim news: more chambers, more cages, and evidence that this had been going on for decades. Bones in the deeper sections were old enough to crumble at touch. "How many people has this thing taken?" Eugene asked, but nobody answered because we all knew it was too many to count. We needed to get the survivors out immediately, but Amelia kept repeating her warning: "Sunset. Sunset. It comes back at sunset." I checked my watch, 4:30 p.m. We had maybe 2 hours of daylight left. As we prepared to evacuate, Marvin found something that changed everything. A journal, wrapped in plastic and hidden in a crevice. The first entry was dated 15 years ago, written by a previous park ranger named Richardson. Day 47. "It took the Henderson family last night. I know because I can hear the children crying in the caves. God forgive me, I've been feeding it, leaving deer carcasses to keep it satisfied, hoping it would leave the hikers alone. But it's getting bolder. It wants human prey now." The final entry was just 2 words: "Can't stop." We need to collapse this cave, I decided. Seal it permanently before it claims anyone else. But as we helped the survivors toward the tunnel exit, a sound echoed from deeper in the cave system, that same howl we'd heard the night before, but closer now. Much closer. "Move," I shouted. "Everyone out now." Behind us, something large was moving through the tunnels, and it was moving fast. The tunnel behind us erupted with sound, claws scraping against stone, heavy breathing that echoed off the cave walls, and that terrible howling that seemed to come from everywhere at once. We had 3 survivors who could barely walk in a cave system that was about to become our tomb. Melvin and Curtis took point, helping Isabel and Mia while I supported Amelia. She kept muttering numbers under her breath. 12 years. 12 years. It's been 12 years since Richardson disappeared." The journal's revelation hit me like a physical blow. Richardson, the ranger before me, hadn't transferred to another park as the official records claimed. He'd been feeding this creature, and when that failed, he'd become another victim. 60 feet to the entrance, Eugene called back, his voice tight with controlled panic. That's when we saw the eyes. Yellow, predatory, reflecting our flashlight beams from the tunnel behind us. The creature was gaining ground, moving through passages it had traveled for years while we stumbled over unfamiliar terrain. "Fred, Steve, set up a defensive position at the tunnel mouth," I ordered. "Everyone else get the survivors to the clearing." The first clear look at the beast nearly broke my sanity. It emerged from the tunnel in a flowing motion that was part wolf, part human, and entirely wrong. Its torso was humanoid but covered in coarse dark fur. The head was distinctly canine, elongated snout, pointed ears, rows of teeth designed for tearing flesh. But it was the intelligence in those yellow eyes that truly terrified me. This wasn't just an animal, it was something that could plan, hunt, and learn. Ted and Stewart opened fire with their hunting rifles. The bullets struck home. I saw the impacts, but the creature barely flinched. It stood nearly 8 feet tall on its hind legs, massively muscled, with claws that could disembowel a man with a single swipe. "Silver," gasped Amelia. Richardson's journal mentioned silver, said regular bullets just made it angry. The beast charged. Philip and Carl dove aside as several hundred pounds of supernatural predator crashed through our defensive line. Wesley managed one clean shot with his .36 before razor-sharp claws opened his shoulder to the bone. The creature's speed was impossible, one moment attacking Wesley, the next spinning to swipe at Roy, who barely rolled away in time. "The clearing," I shouted. "Fall back to the clearing." We retreated in stages, laying down covering fire that seemed to do nothing but annoy our pursuer. The beast followed, sometimes dropping to all fours for speed, sometimes rearing up on hind legs to swipe at us. Its howls had changed tone, no longer mournful but triumphant. It was herding us exactly where it wanted us to go. The circular clearing felt like a trap now, surrounded by trees too thick to penetrate quickly. Barry and Craig helped position the survivors in the center while Lance and Doug formed a perimeter. The creature emerged from the tree line and began circling us, just outside effective shooting range. "It's playing with us," Neil whispered, and he was right. The beast would dart forward, forcing us to waste ammunition, then fade back into the shadows. It was learning our positions, testing our responses. Howard found Richardson's final cache hidden beneath a fallen log, silver bullets, blessed by some desperate priest, along with a final note: "If you're reading this, I've failed. The beast is too strong, too smart. It's been feeding on humans for generations. The only way to stop it is to burn the entire cave system, seal it forever."
How do we get close enough to use silver bullets? Asked Randall, loading the blessed ammunition into his revolver.
The answer came from an unexpected source. Gene, a local trapper, had been quiet throughout the ordeal, but now he spoke up. "Dogs hunt in packs, but they protect their territory alone. This thing's been circling because it doesn't want us to escape, but it also doesn't want us to damage its lair." Vernon nodded grimly. "So we make it choose. Save its den or hunt us." I pulled out the emergency flares from my pack. "Ross, Warren, take half the men back to the cave entrance. Set fires, make noise, threaten its sanctuary. The rest of us will stay here with the survivors. When it comes for us, we'll be ready with silver." It was a desperate plan, but we had no other options. Lee's team moved out, and within minutes we could see smoke rising from the direction of the cave. The beast circling stopped abruptly, its head turning toward the distant flames. For a moment I thought it might abandon us to protect its lair. Then those yellow eyes fixed on our group and I saw the calculation behind them. The creature was too intelligent to be fooled by such a simple strategy. Instead, it attacked with surgical precision. Rick never saw it coming. The beast emerged from the underbrush like a nightmare, covering 30 feet in a single bound. Its claws found Kurt's chest before anyone could react. Then it spun to slash at Bruce, who managed to partially deflect the blow with his rifle stock. Paul fired the first silver bullet. The effect was immediate and devastating. The creature's howl changed from triumph to agony as the blessed silver tore through supernatural flesh. It staggered, black blood flowing from the wound, but it didn't fall. "It's working," Bob shouted, chambering another silver round. Dan and Billy flanked the beast, forcing it to divide its attention. Joe managed to land a second silver bullet in its shoulder, spinning the creature around. But even wounded, it was faster and stronger than any of us. Henry took a claw across the ribs that sent him flying into a tree trunk. Tim's scream cut off abruptly as the beast's jaws clamped down on his arm. Brian emptied his revolver, 3 silver bullets finding their mark, before the creature backhanded him across the clearing. Ken and Jerry coordinated the final assault. While Jerry distracted the beast from the front, Ken moved behind it with Richardson's blessed silver knife, the ranger's final weapon against the creature that had consumed his soul. The blade went deep, sliding between the beast's ribs to find its heart. For a moment, time seemed frozen. The creature stood motionless, yellow eyes wide with surprise and fury. Then it collapsed, its massive form hitting the ground with an impact that shook the earth. But even as it died, I could see something that chilled me to the bone. In the failing light, more eyes were reflecting from the tree line, smaller, younger, but unmistakably the same species. The beast hadn't been alone. It had been breeding. The dying beast's final howl echoed through Devil's Hollow like a battle cry, and the tree line came alive with answering calls. Chuck counted at least 6 distinct voices, while Todd estimated 8. The truth was, none of us knew how many creatures were closing in on our position. "The silver bullets," I called out, checking my remaining ammunition. "How many do we have left?" Hank did a quick inventory. Maybe 20 rounds total, plus Richardson's blessed knife. Against God knows how many of those things. The survivors from the cave were in no condition to run. Isabella had collapsed from exhaustion. Mia was still catatonic, and Amelia was barely conscious. Tom and Pete improvised stretchers from branches and jackets while Jimmy and Donnie established a defensive perimeter. The first of the younger beasts emerged from the shadows, smaller than the alpha we'd killed, but still 7 feet tall and built for killing. Its movements were more erratic, less controlled, suggesting these were offspring who hadn't yet learned the patience their parent had shown. "They're hungry," observed Ted, who had returned from setting fires at the cave entrance. and angry. We just killed their provider. Jeff confirmed what we all feared. The cave system extends for miles underground. There could be dozens of them down there, and now they have nothing to lose. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously. Danny managed to put a silver bullet into the first beast, but the second one was already airborne, claws extended toward Mike's throat. Lou tackled Mike aside, taking a gash across his back that would leave permanent scars. These younger creatures fought differently than their parent. More savage, less strategic, driven by rage rather than calculated hunting instincts. Gus discovered this when he tried the flanking maneuver that had worked on the Alpha. The juvenile beast he targeted simply charged straight through his position, accepting a silver bullet wound in exchange for the chance to maul Walt with its claws. Louie and Ralph worked together to bring down the wounded beast, but 2 more emerged from the darkness. The mathematics of survival were becoming clear. We had limited ammunition and unlimited enemies. The cave, I decided. We need to get back to the cave and collapse it from inside. Bury the entire pack. That's suicide, protested Emily, one of the few women in our group who had joined the search party despite the danger. Olivia disagreed. It's the only way to make sure this ends. Otherwise they'll keep hunting, keep killing, until every hiker in the state becomes their prey. Emma pointed toward the tree line, where more eyes were reflecting our flashlight beams. How many people have to die before we admit this is bigger than just rescuing survivors? Ava took charge of evacuating Isabella, Mia, and Amelia. Get them to the ranger station. Call in the National Guard, the FBI, whoever will listen. Tell them to quarantine this entire forest. Sophia grabbed my arm as the evacuation team prepared to move out. You don't have to do this. Let the military handle it. But I knew better. Military response would take hours we didn't have, and in the meantime these creatures would scatter into the surrounding wilderness. Pine Ridge Forest covered 50,000 acres, but it connected to state forests that stretched across 3 counties. If the pack escaped, they could establish new hunting grounds anywhere in the Midwest. Madison led the survivors toward the main trail, while Ellie and I prepared to return to the cave system. Our remaining team consisted of 8 volunteers, men who understood they were probably walking to their deaths but couldn't live with the alternative. Hazel, our communications specialist, managed to get 1 clear radio transmission to the outside world. This is Pine Ridge Emergency. We have a cryptid incident in Devil's Hollow. Multiple casualties. Unknown number of hostile entities. Recommend immediate military response and forest evacuation. The response came back garbled by static, but we caught enough words to understand. Confirmed. En route. 2 hours. 2 hours. We had to survive 2 hours and keep the pack contained. The journey back to the cave was a running battle. Nora used our second-to-last flare to blind 1 creature long enough for Zoe to put a silver bullet in its skull. Riley and Victoria worked as a sniper team, with Riley spotting targets while Victoria made each shot count. She'd been a competitive marksman before becoming a park ranger. At the cave entrance, the fires we'd set earlier had spread into the tunnel system. Smoke poured from multiple openings, and we could hear the creatures inside howling in confusion and rage. But instead of driving them out, the smoke seemed to be driving them deeper into the earth. They're retreating to the lower chambers, I realized. The fire's creating a natural barrier, but it won't last long enough. We needed a permanent solution. Richardson's journal had mentioned structural weaknesses in the cave system, places where a controlled explosion could bring down the entire network. But that would require someone to go inside, plant charges, and manually detonate them. A suicide mission. I'll do it, I volunteered, but every member of the team immediately objected. This was my idea, argued Emily. I should be the one to carry it out. No, Olivia countered. I know explosives from my military service. I have the best chance of doing it right. Emma settled the debate by pointing out what we all should have realized. We don't have proper explosives, but we have something better. Propane tanks from the emergency supply cache, road flares, and about a dozen bullets worth of gunpowder. Ava had the training to make improvised charges work. As a demolitions expert in Iraq, she'd learned to work with whatever materials were available. Within 30 minutes, she'd assembled enough explosive power to bring down a small building. Timer fuse gives us maybe 4 minutes to get clear, she explained. But someone has to carry the charges to the structural weak points Richardson identified. the deepest parts of the cave system. As we prepared for the final descent, something changed in the forest around us. The howling stopped. The creatures had gone silent, and somehow that was infinitely more terrifying than their rage had been. "They're planning something," whispered Sophia. She was right. In the distance we could see movement through the trees. Not the chaotic charging of before, but coordinated positioning. The surviving pack members were surrounding the cave entrance, preparing for a siege. They knew we were coming back. The silence was absolute. No wind through the trees, no night birds calling, no insects chirping, just the oppressive quiet that comes before a storm. We crouched at the edge of the clearing, watching the cave entrance and the dozen pairs of yellow eyes that watched us back. "It's a trap," Madison whispered, stating what we all knew. Ellie checked the improvised explosive charges one final time. 4 minutes from ignition to detonation. That's how long we have to get clear of the blast radius. The mathematics were brutal. The structural weak points Richardson had identified were deep in the cave system. At least 5 minutes of travel through narrow tunnels. We'd have to plant the charges and retreat through a collapsing cave system while being hunted by creatures that knew every passage. Hazel's radio crackled with an update from the outside world. "Military response ETA 45 minutes. Evacuating civilian population within 5-mile radius. Maintain position." 45 minutes felt like forever when we could see the pack growing bolder. They'd learned to fear our silver bullets, but they were also running out of patience. Soon, hunger would overcome caution, and they'd attack regardless of casualties. "I'm going alone," I decided. "One person can move faster, make less noise. The rest of you create a distraction. Draw them away from the cave entrance." Nora shook her head. "You can't carry all the charges and place them correctly by yourself. You need at least one other person." Zoe volunteered immediately. "I know those tunnels from our earlier exploration. I can guide us to the weak points while you handle the explosives." It wasn't a good plan, but it was the only plan we had. Riley and Victoria would lead a diversionary attack from the east, making as much noise as possible to draw the pack away from the cave. The rest of our team would maintain the perimeter, ready to provide covering fire for our retreat. If we survived the retreat, we synchronized our watches. 11:47 p.m. At midnight, the distraction would begin. Zoe and I would have a narrow window to reach the cave entrance while the creatures were focused on the false attack. The minutes crawled by. I used the time to write a letter that might never be delivered. Apologies to my wife, explanations for my children, a record of what we'd discovered in Devil's Hollow. If the plan failed, at least investigators would eventually understand what had happened here. At 11:59, I folded the letter and tucked it into my jacket pocket. Zoe checked the timer detonators one last time, then looked me in the eye. "Ready?" The diversionary attack exploded across the clearing with shocking violence. Riley's team had positioned themselves with overlapping fields of fire, and their coordinated volleys sent the pack scattering for cover. Silver bullets sparked against trees and stones, and the creatures' howls returned full force as they realized they were under assault. Zoe and I sprinted for the cave entrance while the pack's attention was focused elsewhere. The smoke from our earlier fires had mostly dissipated, but the smell of ash and burned wood still filled the tunnels. Our flashlight beams revealed claw marks on the walls, fresh gouges where panicked creatures had scrambled deeper into the earth. The first structural weak point was 200 yards into the tunnel system, where a natural limestone arch supported the ceiling of a major chamber. Zoe placed the first charge while I watched for movement from the deeper passages. "Timer set," she whispered. 3 minutes 45 seconds to detonation. We moved to the second location, a junction where 3 tunnels met. The ceiling here was already cracked from decades of water seepage. Richardson's notes indicated that a relatively small explosion could bring down the entire intersection. That's when we heard them coming. The distinctive sound of claws on stone echoed from every tunnel simultaneously. The pack had realized the surface attack was a diversion, and now they were converging on us from multiple directions. "Second charge placed," Zoe reported. 2 minutes 30 seconds. The third and final weak point was the deepest, a cavern where an underground stream had worn away the supporting pillars over centuries. We could hear water dripping in the darkness ahead, and something else, the sound of many creatures breathing. Our flashlight beams revealed the truth. The cavern was full of them, not just the pack members we'd seen on the surface, but juveniles, elderly creatures, females with cubs. This wasn't just a hunting ground, it was a breeding colony that had been growing for decades. How many? Zoe whispered. I counted at least 30 pairs of eyes reflecting our lights. Generations of creatures that had lived their entire lives in these caves, feeding on human prey brought by their pack hunters. We can't kill them all, Zoe said quietly. We don't have to. We just have to bring down the cave. But to reach the final structural weak point, we'd have to cross the cavern. 30 supernatural predators stood between us and the collapse charges that would end this nightmare forever. 1 minute 45 seconds on the timer. The first creature charged before we'd taken 3 steps into the cavern. Zoe put a silver bullet in its chest, but 2 more immediately took its place. I emptied my remaining blessed ammunition into the advancing pack, but there were too many of them. Claws raked across my shoulder as I rolled aside from one attacker. Zoe screamed as another creature's jaws clamped down on her leg. The blessed knife. Richardson's final gift found its way into my hand, and I drove it deep into the beast's neck. 1 minute 15 seconds. We fought our way across the cavern in a desperate running battle. Every step cost us blood. Every second brought us closer to the detonation that would kill us along with our enemies. But the final charge had to be placed precisely, or the collapse would be partial, leaving escape routes that would allow survivors to eventually rebuild their colony. 55 seconds. Zoe collapsed against the far wall, her leg too damaged to carry her weight. Go, she gasped. Place the charge. Get out of here. Not without you. 40 seconds. I hauled Zoe to her feet, supporting most of her weight as we limped toward the structural weak point Richardson had identified. The creatures were regrouping for a final assault, but they seemed confused by the timer's steady beeping, a sound they'd never encountered before. 30 seconds. The final charge clicked into place against a load-bearing pillar that supported the cavern's ceiling. All around us, the pack was howling in rage and frustration, but they didn't understand what the small device would do to their ancient home. 20 seconds. We stumbled back toward the tunnel entrance, but Zoe's injured leg gave out completely. She collapsed, dragging both of us to the ground as the creatures closed in for the kill. 15 seconds. I could have abandoned her. Should have abandoned her. The mission was complete, and one life wasn't worth the failure of everything we'd sacrificed to achieve. Instead, I picked up Richardson's blessed knife and made our final stand. 10 seconds. The alpha female of the pack, larger than the male we'd killed earlier, reared up on her hind legs and prepared to finish us. Her yellow eyes held the same intelligent malevolence I'd seen in her mate, but also something else, the protective fury of a mother defending her young. 5 seconds. I looked into those alien eyes and saw my own reflection, another predator willing to kill to protect what mattered most. 4, 3, 2. The explosion shattered the world. Stone and timber collapsed in a cascade that seemed to go on forever. The tunnel system pancaked in on itself, sealing chambers that had existed for centuries. Water from the underground stream flooded the remaining spaces, drowning anything that might have survived the initial collapse. We were thrown clear by the blast wave, tumbling through a secondary tunnel that led to an exit we hadn't known existed. When the dust settled, Zoe and I lay bleeding in a pile of rubble under the open night sky. Behind us, Devil's Hollow was gone, replaced by a smoking crater where the ground had simply collapsed into the destroyed cave system. The military arrived 20 minutes later, followed by emergency medical teams that airlifted us to the regional hospital. The official report classified the incident as a sinkhole collapse caused by geological instability. The missing hikers were presumed dead, buried under tons of limestone and clay. I never told them about the eyes I'd seen in those final moments. Smaller eyes, watching from tunnels too distant to be affected by the explosion. Young creatures that had survived because they'd been in the deepest parts of the cave system when the charges detonated. 6 months later, I transferred to a park in Arizona, desert country where there are no dark forests, no deep caves, and no legends of creatures that hunt in the night. But sometimes, when the wind is right, I still hear howling in the distance. And I know that somewhere, in caves we never found, the hunt continues. My name is Eugene Kim, and this happened to me back in 1997 in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, Minnesota, when I lived off the grid near a quiet inlet surrounded by thick fir trees, tangled undergrowth, and lakes so still you could watch a canoe glide across them without so much as a ripple. I had come out here 2 years earlier, trying to get away from the noise of Chicago, the snide remarks of old coworkers, and the dull ache of feeling like I wasn't doing a single thing in life that mattered. Out here it felt like every day was my own. No bosses, no neighbors, no one to tell me I was doing it wrong. It was early May, the ice long melted, and the nights still cool. My cabin sat on a small clearing a quarter-mile from a narrow lake with dark water and sloping shores strewn with pine needles. I built that cabin myself from cheap lumber, a crooked frame, and sheer stubbornness. If I leaned too hard on one wall, the whole place creaked like an old man's knee, and I had to admit it was far from perfect. But it was mine. On this particular morning, I woke up feeling restless. A strange heaviness hung in the air that I couldn't explain. I sat outside sipping coffee. I'd brewed too strong, thinking how quiet it was, a distant loon, wind in the spruce, nothing else. The silence had a weight to it I hadn't noticed before. The woods seemed to be holding their breath. My shotgun leaned against the log wall beside me. I used it mostly for hunting grouse and the occasional hare, though I never liked pulling the trigger. The recoil always bruised my shoulder, leaving a dull ache that lasted for days. I remember adjusting my wool hat and thinking I should stock up on firewood for the night still cold enough to see my breath. I had a small axe and a decent saw. The birches near the lake shore were good for kindling. While walking down to the water, I noticed something odd. A canoe, bright red, overturned at the edge of the lake, tied off but floating at a strange angle as if someone had left in a hurry. It wasn't mine. I didn't know anyone else who camped this close to my spot. Folks pass through sometimes, but not often this early in the year. I hesitated, then moved closer. Hello? My voice sounded thin and ordinary against the vastness of the wilderness. No reply. The morning air carried the smell of damp leaves and muddy ground. But there was something else. Something metallic and wrong that made my stomach tighten. As I got closer, I saw a single paddle stuck upright in the mud. That's when I spotted a torn pack, half submerged, and some clothes scattered along the shore. The clothes looked like a man's flannel shirt and jeans, soaked and dirty. My heart began to thump harder. I spotted footprints that led from the shore into the thicker brush. They were big, heavier than mine, and I'm not exactly small. I weighed about 200 pounds. And these tracks looked deeper than anything I could make. I told myself it could be a trapper, a fisherman maybe. Still, it felt off. Something in me wanted to turn back, to return to my cabin and pretend I'd never seen the red canoe. But curiosity, or perhaps something deeper and more primal, propelled me forward. I followed those footprints quietly, parting damp branches. The forest felt different now. No longer the familiar backdrop to my solitary life, but something watchful and secretive. 50 yards in, I saw a pile of disturbed leaves near a fallen log. Something red caught my eye. I crouched down and nearly lost my breakfast. It was a man's body, face down, blood soaked around the neck and shoulders. He wore an old baseball cap that had rolled a few feet away. The back of his shirt was shredded, his arms splayed awkwardly. I didn't know him. He looked about 40, maybe older, and he wasn't moving. I reached out to check his pulse, but I already knew. The ground had soaked up a dark, sticky patch. My hand shook. Jesus Christ, I muttered. That's when I heard something snap behind me. A branch. A step. I turned slowly, heart hammering against my ribs. A man stood there, maybe 10 feet away. He was tall and wiry, with a shaved head and a crooked nose that looked like it had been broken more than once. He wore a faded green jacket and heavy boots. He held a large hunting knife, blade catching a bit of morning light. He didn't speak at first. His eyes locked onto mine, and I saw something hard and mean in that gaze, like he didn't have the patience for conversation. I felt my knees weaken. I realized I had nothing but my hands. "Step away," he said. Just 2 words, low and direct. I took a step back, lifting my hand slightly as if that would help. He moved forward, and I saw old scars on his knuckles. The guy didn't look scared or rushed. He looked like he knew exactly what he was doing. I tried to calm myself, to think. I'd left my shotgun at the cabin. Not smart, I had a folding knife in my pocket, but that was no match for a killer who had just taken a man's life. My mouth went dry, and I could hear my pulse throbbing in my ears. "Look," I said, voice cracking. "I don't want trouble." He didn't seem to care. He pointed the knife toward me, his arm steady. The blade gleamed dully in the filtered morning light. His eyes were the color of slate, revealing nothing but cold determination. I took another step back and stumbled over a root. He moved in a sudden arc, grabbing my collar. I smelled old sweat and something like tobacco on him. He threw me down and I felt a sharp pain in my shoulder. I scrambled backward, my boots slipping on wet leaves. His knife flashed near my face. I thought he might be deciding whether to kill me right there or drag me off somewhere. A panic took hold. I kicked out. My foot caught his shin, and he cursed, a guttural sound that barely seemed human. He swung the knife wildly at my arm. It grazed my jacket, slitting the fabric, scratching my forearm. The pain flared hot and immediate. I yelled, the sound ripping from my throat before I could stop it. He raised the knife again, but in that moment I rolled sideways and managed to pull free. I didn't have a plan. I just ran. I crashed through the brush, my body shaking, my arm bleeding. I could hear him behind me, heavy footsteps breaking branches, not caring about noise. My cabin wasn't far, and I realized my best chance was to get there, grab the shotgun, and try to hold him off. The forest that had been my sanctuary for 2 years now became a maze of obstacles, branches clawing at my face, roots threatening to trip me, soft earth giving way underfoot. I zigzagged, my breath coming in gasps. I heard him swear behind me, calling me names. I swear I could feel his breath, but that was probably my imagination. The cut on my arm throbbed, warm blood seeping through my sleeve. The trees seemed to close in around me. I recognized a lightning-struck pine. I was getting close to my clearing. My lungs burned, sweat ran into my eyes. I could hear him gaining ground. "You're dead," he called, his voice carrying through the trees. "You're already dead." I refused to believe him. I broke into my small clearing and darted inside my cabin, slamming the flimsy door. I yanked my shotgun off the wall. My shells were in a tin box on the shelf. My fingers fumbled, and I spilled them, scrambling to pick up two, loading them quickly while trying not to sob. It felt like an eternity. The door rattled. The lock wouldn't hold. It was just a simple latch I'd built myself, never meant to keep out a determined man with murder on his mind. I took a deep breath. "Who are you?" I shouted, trying to sound tough. No reply, just silence, then a scraping sound. I thought he might be circling around. I realized my cabin had just one door and a tiny back window. If he got in, I'd have nowhere to run. The walls suddenly seemed paper thin, the roof too low. My sanctuary had become a trap. I forced the window open, shoved out a box of old tools, and climbed through, landing on my backside. My shirt caught on a nail and tore. I didn't care. I stood up, holding the shotgun. If he came around, I'd have to face him. I moved slowly around the cabin, trying to keep quiet. A breeze picked up, rustling the pines. The sound masked my footsteps, but also his. I pressed my back against the rough logs of my cabin, inching along the wall. I spotted him near a birch tree about 20 yards out, crouched low, scanning. He held that knife low by his side, his shoulders tense. He hadn't seen me yet. I watched him turn slowly, surveying the area, looking for movement. His eyes narrowed as he studied my cabin's open window. I swallowed hard. Shooting a man was a horrible thought, but he'd killed someone already. Probably a traveler who crossed his path. He'd nearly gotten me. I couldn't just let him come at me again. My heart hammered in my ears. I aimed the shotgun. But the angle was bad, and I didn't trust myself. I tried to circle around quietly. I stepped on a twig, and he whipped his head around. Our eyes met. He charged. I had no choice. I fired. The blast kicked me backward. I missed. Bark flew from a trunk behind him. He ducked, dropped to a crouch, and rushed sideways, forcing me to pivot. My hands shook. I had one shell left in the chamber. He knew it. He grinned, teeth slightly crooked, and rushed forward in a zigzag. His eyes never left mine. Cold, calculating, patient. I tried to stay calm, steady my aim. The world narrowed to just him and me. The forest, the lake, my cabin. All of it fell away. There was only this moment, this choice. He was close now, close enough that I could see a scar running along his jaw, close enough that I could hear his breathing. I fired my second shot. This time I hit him, catching him in the upper torso. He stumbled, gasped, and then fell hard onto his side. A strange quiet followed, except for his ragged breathing. I stepped closer, still aiming, my heart pounding harder than ever. He rolled onto his back, blood staining his jacket. He opened his mouth but said nothing. His eyes flicked to my boots, then the sky, then settled somewhere beyond me. I watched his chest rise and fall unevenly. He choked, shuddered, and then stopped moving. I kept the gun trained on him for at least a minute, afraid he might lunge up. He didn't. It was done. I sat down on a stump, my legs trembling. The morning light had shifted. I felt dizzy and cold. There was a dead stranger by my cabin and another body in the woods. I remembered the victim's canoe, that red hull drifting. I'd have to get help. The nearest ranger station was half a day's hike. My arm stung. I peeled back my jacket to see a shallow cut, bleeding but not too bad. I wrapped it with a bandana. My throat felt dry as old bark. I wanted water, whiskey, anything. As I moved toward the lake, I kept thinking how stupid I'd been, how this peaceful life I loved had turned so suddenly ugly. My world had been quiet and safe in my head. Now there were two corpses, a ruined morning, and a sick feeling that would cling to me for a long time. I imagined explaining this to a ranger. I was minding my own business. This guy attacked me. He killed another man down by the shore. It sounded crazy, but it was true. I'd have to show them the bodies, hope they believed me. I washed my face at the lake's edge, the water shockingly cold. The red canoe bobbed gently. I turned it upright and found a name etched inside, Pete something. I couldn't read it well. I sighed. Whoever he was, he hadn't deserved that fate. I thought of going through his pack for an ID, but I decided not to, right then. I just sat there, my back against a pine trunk, and stared across the water. The sun had risen higher, making tiny diamonds on the surface. The quiet had returned, as if nothing unusual had happened. But now I had this weight inside me. I would have to leave here and find a ranger. Explain it all, deal with the questions, maybe even suspicions. I'd have to face my own regret at taking a life, even if I had no choice. I felt a hollow ache in my chest. Maybe living off the grid didn't guarantee peace. The world still seeped into the cracks. People with knives and ugly secrets could find you anywhere. I thought I was free out here, but I was just isolated. There were no neighbors to call for help, no friendly stranger to come running. I was alone, and that was both good and bad. I packed my shotgun and tried to calm down. I looked over at the killer's body lying near my cabin. I would have to report this, give a statement, and watch as strangers in uniform swarmed my quiet clearing. My cabin, my flimsy home, would be on the record. Maybe I'd have to leave. Maybe they'd say it was self-defense. But still, they might poke around until I couldn't stand it. I took a deep breath and started walking toward the ranger station, leaving behind the morning's violence, but carrying its memory with me. The hike to the ranger station took longer than I expected. My arm throbbed, and every sound in the forest made me flinch. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that man with the knife again, even though I knew he was dead. I had killed him. The reality of that struck me with each step. The ranger station was a simple wooden building with a green metal roof. When I stumbled in, a tall woman in a Forest Service uniform looked up from her desk. Her name tag read, Ranger Mills. I must have been a sight. Blood-stained, dirty, wild-eyed. "Sir?" She stood up quickly. "Are you all right?" The words spilled out of me in a jumble. A red canoe. A dead man. Another man with a knife. I had to shoot him. 2 bodies back at my cabin. She made me sit down, gave me water, and radioed for backup. "Start from the beginning," she said calmly, pulling out a notebook. Slowly this time. I told her everything. The canoe, the body, being attacked, firing the shotgun. She wrote it all down without expression, but her eyes were sharp, assessing. When I finished, she asked me to wait while she made some calls. 2 hours later, I was sitting in the back of a Forest Service truck, heading back to my cabin with Ranger Mills and 2 state police officers. No one said much on the ride. I felt numb, disconnected from everything. At my cabin, I showed them where it had happened. The body of the man I'd shot was still there, exactly as I'd left him. One of the officers took photographs while Ranger Mills asked me more questions. I led them to the lake, to the red canoe, and then into the woods to the first body. Except the body wasn't there. It was right here, I insisted, pointing to the disturbed ground. By this fallen log. Ranger Mills and the officers exchanged glances. One of them crouched down, examining the area. "There's blood," he confirmed. "Something happened here." We spent the next hour searching the surrounding woods. No body, just some blood-stained leaves and trampled undergrowth. I felt sick, confused. I knew what I had seen. Maybe an animal dragged it away, one officer suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. Back at my cabin, they took more statements. They searched the dead man's pockets and found a wallet with an ID, Paul Mercer, 45, from Duluth. No criminal record that they could access by radio. Just a man with a knife who had tried to kill me. "We need to find the other victim," Ranger Mills said finally. "We'll get a search team out here first thing tomorrow." The officers wanted to take me in for further questioning, but Ranger Mills intervened. "He's injured, exhausted, and in shock," she said. "I'll stay with him tonight. You can question him more tomorrow." After they left with Mercer's body in a black bag, Ranger Mills built a fire in my wood stove. She had radioed for a doctor who would arrive in the morning to check my arm. "You should try to rest," she said, her voice gentler than before. "I can't," I replied. "Every time I close my eyes, I see him coming at me with that knife." She nodded. "That's normal. It'll take time." "The other body," I said. "You believe me, right? That I saw it?" She considered this. "I believe you saw something. The blood suggests you're telling the truth. But without a body..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Without a body, my story was incomplete. Suspicious. Even. I had killed a man. Self-defense, I claimed. But what if there was no other victim? What if I had imagined it all? No, I hadn't. I knew what I saw. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept listening for sounds outside, imagining footsteps, imagining that somehow Paul Mercer had come back to life and was circling my cabin. Ranger Mills dozed in a chair by the wood stove, her radio occasionally crackling with static. Around 3 a.m., I heard something outside, a soft scraping sound against the cabin wall. Ranger Mills heard it too. She was instantly alert, hand moving to her sidearm. "Stay here," she whispered, moving to the window. She peered out into the darkness, then relaxed slightly. "Just a raccoon," she said. But I wasn't convinced. I joined her at the window. The night was clear, with a half-moon casting silver light on my clearing. Nothing moved. "There," she pointed, and I saw it then. A small masked face looking back at us before scurrying away into the underbrush. I exhaled slowly. Just a raccoon. Nothing more. But the unease remained, settling deep in my bones like the cold. Morning came with a thin mist rising from the lake. The search team arrived early. 6 rangers and a dog handler with a German shepherd trained to find human remains. Ranger Mills introduced me to Dr. Carson, a gray-haired man with gentle hands who cleaned and properly bandaged my arm. "Not too deep," he said, "but keep it clean. Come see me in town next week to check for infection." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I'd ever return to town. This place, my sanctuary, felt different now, tainted. The quiet that had once been comforting now seemed ominous. Every shadow held a threat. The search team spread out through the woods. I led them to where I had found the first body, and they began a methodical grid search outward from that point. The dog sniffed eagerly at the blood-stained ground, then pulled his handler deeper into the forest. While they searched, I sat on my cabin steps with Ranger Mills. More officers had arrived to investigate the area around my cabin where I had shot Mercer. They took more photographs, collected shell casings, measured distances. "What happens next?" I asked Ranger Mills. "That depends on what we find," she replied honestly. "If there's another body, it supports your story. If not," she shrugged, "we'll have to dig deeper." I nodded, understanding the implication. I didn't know him, Mercer. I'd never seen him before. We're checking into his background, she said. Maybe that will tell us something. Around noon, there was a commotion in the woods. The dog had found something. Ranger Mills and I hurried toward the shouting. About a quarter mile from where I had originally seen the body, down a steep ravine, the search team had found him. The victim lay face down in a small creek, his body partially submerged. The rangers were carefully documenting the scene before moving him. He was dragged, one ranger explained, pointing to marks on the ground. Someone pulled him down here after he was killed. My head spun. Mercer must have moved him after I found the body, but why? Ranger Mills shook her head. That's what we need to figure out. The victim was carefully removed from the creek and placed in a body bag. Before they zipped it up, I caught a glimpse of his face, pale, waxy, eyes half open. He looked younger than I had thought, maybe mid-30s. Back at my cabin, a ranger approached with news. We found an ID in his wallet. Name's Peter Laskoski, 36, from Minneapolis. He handed Ranger Mills a plastic evidence bag containing a soggy wallet. The canoe, I said. It had Pete carved into it. Ranger Mills nodded. What would bring Peter Laskoski out here in early May alone? And why would Mercer kill him? No one had an answer. The investigation continued through the afternoon. More officers arrived. They took my shotgun as evidence. They photographed the inside of my cabin, asked about my life here, how long I'd been living off the grid. By evening, most of them had left. Only Ranger Mills and 2 officers remained, planning to stay one more night before escorting me to town for a formal statement. As darkness fell, Ranger Mills received a radio call. She stepped outside to take it, returning with a grim expression. They've identified both men, she said. Paul Mercer was a fugitive, wanted for 2 murders in Wisconsin, violent home invasions. He'd been on the run for 6 months. I felt a chill. And Laskoski? Peter Laskoski was a freelance journalist. He wrote for outdoor magazines mostly, but his editor says he was working on a piece about fugitives hiding in wilderness areas. She paused. He was tracking Mercer. The pieces fell into place. Laskoski had found Mercer, and Mercer had killed him for it. Then I had stumbled onto the scene, another witness to eliminate. So I struggled to find the words. In the wrong place at the wrong time, Ranger Mills finished for me. Mercer couldn't leave witnesses. That night I sat outside my cabin, looking at the stars. The officers had gone to bed in their tents. Ranger Mills joined me, offering a cigarette which I declined. What will you do now? She asked. I considered this. I don't know. I came out here to find peace, to escape. I gestured at the dark woods around us. But maybe there's no such thing as escape. The world finds you wherever you go. She nodded. People think wilderness is empty. It never is. It's full of stories, histories, lives intersecting. We sat in silence for a while. You saved yourself, she said finally. Remember that. When the nightmares come, and they will, remember that you did what you had to do. I knew she was right, but it didn't make it easier. I had taken a life. Justified or not, that weight would stay with me. The next morning, as we prepared to leave, I took one last look at my cabin, the crooked frame, the uneven walls, the small garden I had planted. For 2 years, it had been my refuge. Now it seemed small and vulnerable against the vastness of the forest. I'll come back, I told Ranger Mills, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. Most people don't, she replied. Not after something like this. As we hiked away from the clearing, I felt the wilderness watching me go. The trees swayed slightly in the morning breeze. A loon called from the lake. The world continued, indifferent to the violence that had erupted in its midst. I had come to the boundary waters seeking solitude, believing that isolation meant safety. Now I understood that nowhere is truly isolated. We carry our vulnerabilities with us wherever we go. The real wilderness isn't out there in the trees and lakes. It's the unknown terrain of other people's intentions, the dark forests of their minds. And sometimes, no matter how far you run, that wilderness finds you. Being a park ranger means knowing every inch of your territory, except for the places that seem to shift when you're not looking. My name is Dale Hutchins, and this happened to me back in 2013 in the Bitterroot National Forest, Montana. What I'm about to tell you defies everything I thought I knew about the wilderness I'd protected for 15 years. I'd taken the early shift because I liked the hush before campers wake. That half-light when smoke from last night's fires hangs low and nothing wrong has happened yet. But that morning, the silence felt different, heavier. The usual dawn chorus of birds was absent, replaced by a vacuum of sound that made my ears ring. At dawn, I checked the south trailhead, logged weather data, and chatted with a married pair of birders who swore they'd heard trumpeter swans. But their hands shook as they spoke, and they kept glancing toward the tree line as if something watched from between the pines. The woman, Sarah, she said her name was, mentioned hearing voices in the trees during the night. Her husband Michael quickly corrected her, saying it was probably just wind through the branches. But I saw the way his knuckles went white, gripping his binoculars. By 8 a.m. I was back in the Ranger truck. Coffee cooling in the cup holder, boots on the dash. The radio crackled with static, more than usual. Interference that formed almost like whispers if you listened long enough. I was thinking the day might stay quiet when dispatch finally broke through the white noise. Solo hiker overdue on the canyon spur. I acknowledged and radioed my partner James Ortega to meet me at mile marker 34. His voice came back strained, distant. Copy that, Dale. But something's been wrong with the radio chatter all morning. Been hearing voices that ain't ours. Canyon spur is steep, narrow, and seldom used this early in the season. Patches of snow linger beneath cedar shade and spring runoff turns the switchbacks greasy. But as I drove up the access road, I noticed something else wrong. The trees, they looked different, not in any way I could articulate. The bark patterns seemed to writhe when caught in my peripheral vision, and the shadows between trunks appeared deeper than they should have been with morning light filtering through. 200 yards in, I spotted the hiker's footprints. Size 11 boots, deep tread, moving steadily uphill. But 20 yards further, they ended at a churned patch of mud. So wide I first thought avalanche debris had slid across the trail. As I crouched for a closer look, the forest went dead quiet. Not the usual hush when a hawk passes, but a blanket of stillness that pressed the air flat and made my sinuses ache. In the mud lay impressions too deep for elk and set too wide apart for anything I knew. Four-toed, almost talon-shaped and spaced like whatever owned them, walked upright on legs far longer than human proportions should allow. The largest print measured 19 inches from heel to claw tip, with heel depth almost 3 inches. But it was the smell that made my stomach turn. A sweet, rotten scent like flowers left too long in standing water. James arrived, saw the prints, and his face went pale. "Probably pranksters," he said, but he wouldn't step closer. His voice carried that forced casualness people use when they're trying to convince themselves more than anyone else. We followed faint drag marks downhill until the forest opened into a mossy glade where steam rose from a gutted mule deer. No scavengers circled. Even the flies kept their distance. Flesh had been peeled in long, neat ribbons as if by hooked knives, but there was something methodical about it, artistic almost. The hide lay spread in a perfect circle around the carcass, and the bones had been arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. I snapped photos for fish and wildlife, but the camera kept malfunctioning. The display showed images of empty forest even though I was clearly photographing the kill site. When I tried again, the screen flickered and showed a figure standing between distant trees, tall, wrong-shaped, watching. I lowered the camera and looked at the actual spot. Nothing there. "Dale," James whispered, and his voice cracked like a teenager's. "Do you hear that?" I listened. Beneath the oppressive silence came a sound like breathing, but not from lungs, from something much larger, as if the forest itself inhaled and exhaled in slow, measured rhythm. And underneath that, so faint I might have imagined it, came the sound of claws scraping against bark. "We need to call this in," I said, but my radio produced only static. The kind of white noise that forms patterns if you listen too long. Patterns that sound almost like words in a language you don't recognize. That's when James pointed toward the tree line. "Jesus Christ, Dale, look." 50 yards away, something pale moved between the trunks. It stood upright but too tall, too narrow, joints bending in directions that violated anatomy. For just a moment it seemed to be watching us. Then it turned and melted back into the shadows with a fluid grace that made my eyes water to follow. Did you see? James started. The radio crackled. A voice came through, distant and hollow. Help me, please, I'm lost. Can anyone hear me? But the voice was wrong. Too perfect, too clear. And underneath the words I could swear I heard something else. A wet clicking sound, like a mouth that wasn't quite the right shape for human speech trying to form our words. James grabbed the mic. This is Ranger Ortega. What's your location? I'm hurt, the voice replied. Something's following me. It's been following me all night, please hurry. Where are you? I took the mic. Can you see any landmarks? The trees, the voice whispered. And now it sounded different. Less human. The trees are watching. They have too many eyes. The transmission cut to static. I looked at James. His face had gone the color of old snow. That wasn't the missing hiker, he said. No. I agreed it wasn't. That's when we heard the screaming. The screaming came from deeper in the forest. High and desperate. Human. Or something doing a very good impression of human. That could be our missing hiker, James said. But his hand hovered over his service weapon. I checked my rifle loaded, safety off. Could be. We moved toward the sound, following a game trail that seemed to curve and twist more than it should have. The screaming came in bursts, always seeming to originate from just ahead, just out of sight. But each time we crested a hill or rounded a bend, the source had moved further away. After 20 minutes, James stopped. Dale, the trail. I looked back. The path we'd followed was gone. In its place, virgin forest stretched unbroken, as if no trail had ever existed. The trees seemed to have closed ranks behind us. That's not possible, I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew possibility had become irrelevant. The screaming stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard James's breathing turn rapid and shallow. The GPS, he said, pulling out his unit. The screen showed only static, green pixels dancing in meaningless patterns. Mine too. I checked my own device. Same electronic snow. Compass? We both checked. The needle spun lazy circles, never settling on a direction. Okay, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We follow water downhill. Basic survival. But there was no sound of running water. No sound of anything. The forest had become a bubble of silence, broken only by our heartbeats and the soft whisper of our boots on pine needles. We picked a direction and walked. After what felt like hours but could have been minutes. Time seemed unreliable here. We came to a clearing where the missing hiker's belongings lay scattered. Backpack ripped open, contents strewn like guts. A sleeping bag hung from a branch 12 feet high, shredded into ribbons that fluttered without any wind to move them. But it was the trees around the clearing that made my blood freeze. Deep gouges scarred the bark, claw marks climbing 20 feet up the trunks, and in the gouges, something glistened. Not sap, something darker, something that moved. Blood? James whispered. I touched one of the dark stains. It came away sticky on my finger, but when I looked at it closely, tiny things writhed in the fluid. Microscopic thread-like parasites that seemed to sense my body heat and tried to burrow into my skin. I wiped my hand frantically on my jacket. Not blood. That's when we found the first body part. A hand, pale and bloodless, protruded from the base of an enormous cedar. Not buried. The tree had grown around it, bark healing over flesh like scar tissue. The fingers still twitched when I brushed against them. Jesus. James backed away. How long would that take for a tree to grow around? Years, I said. Decades. But the hand looked fresh. The fingernails were still clean, the skin soft and pink. Impossible. A voice called out from deeper in the woods. Help me. I'm hurt. The same voice from the radio. But now it came from a specific direction, maybe 100 yards away. It's trying to lure us, I said. Help, the voice came again, and this time it was James's voice. Perfect mimicry. Dale, help me. It's got me. James stood right beside me, his mouth open in shock at hearing his own voice calling from the forest. Dale, the fake James screamed. It's tearing me apart. Help. The real James grabbed my arm. We need to get out of here now. But as we turned to leave, we found ourselves facing a wall of trees that hadn't been there moments before. Dense, impenetrable, with trunks so close together that not even a child could squeeze between them. That way, I pointed in another direction. More trees. A solid barrier of wood and bark and those dark, glistening gouges. We were trapped. The fake James voice laughed from the woods, a sound like broken glass grinding together. Found you. That's when something huge moved between the distant trees. A shadow that walked upright but cast reflections that didn't match its shape. The gouges in the nearby trees began to weep that dark fluid more heavily, as if responding to the creature's proximity. The radio, I whispered to James. Try the emergency frequency. He keyed the mic with shaking hands. Mayday, mayday. This is Ranger Ortega requesting immediate assistance. We are trapped in Sector 7 by... The radio spoke back in James's own voice. No one's coming, James. No one even knows you're missing yet. James dropped the radio like it had burned him. I raised my rifle toward the moving shadow. Stay behind me. But when I looked through the scope, I saw nothing where the creature should have been. The lens showed only empty forest. Yet I could still see it with my naked eye, growing closer. And the smell hit us like a physical blow, that sweet rot of dead flowers, but now with undertones of decay and something else. Something that reminded me of the way a hospital smells when they're trying to cover up infection with disinfectant. Fire a warning shot, James whispered. I aimed above the creature and pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed strangely, seeming to bounce off invisible walls before fading into a sound like crying. The creature stopped moving. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then every tree in the clearing groaned. The sound started low, like settling timber, but grew into something that vibrated in my chest cavity. The gouges in the bark opened wider, revealing they weren't just surface wounds. They went deep, creating hollow spaces inside the trunks. And from those hollow spaces came a new sound. Breathing. The trees were breathing. The radio crackled back to life with a new voice. Calm, professional, completely normal. Dale, this is dispatch. Camp Whispering Pines called in. 2 kids missing on the perimeter trail. Counselor Macy Reed says she doesn't want to panic the others. I grabbed the mic, relief flooding through me at hearing something real, something from the outside world. Copy dispatch. We've got a situation in Sector 7. Unknown predator. Multiple missing persons. Static. Then Dale, this is dispatch. You called in a solo hiker about an hour ago. Are you feeling all right? I looked at James. His face reflected my confusion. It felt like we'd been in these woods for hours, but the radio suggested otherwise. Never mind that now, I said. We're heading to the camp. Copy. And Dale, be careful. We've had some strange reports from that area today. The moment I acknowledged, the wall of trees simply wasn't there anymore. The forest opened up, revealing the familiar trail back toward the access road. My GPS flickered to life, showing our position exactly where it should be. What the hell just happened? James whispered. I didn't have an answer. But as we hurried toward the vehicles, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The shadows under the trees moved wrong. Instead of staying attached to their objects, they seemed to drift and flow like spilled oil, always staying just at the edge of vision. 20 minutes later, we reached Camp Whispering Pines. The children were gathered at the dining hall windows when I pulled up, their faces pressed against the glass like pale flowers. 30 kids, maybe 11 or 12 years old, and every single one of them looked terrified. Macy Reed met me at the door. Mid-30s, usually composed, but now her hands shook as she spoke. They were just collecting pine cones for a nature project. Timothy and Austin went maybe 100 yards into the woods. 15 minutes tops. Show me where. She led me to a trailhead behind the camp. The path looked normal enough. Pine needles, scattered rocks, the usual forest debris. But 50 yards in, I found the orange ball cap hanging from a fir branch 12 feet high, brim shredded like something with very sharp claws had been playing with it. Under the cap, Austin's backpack lay ripped open, contents scattered, Pokemon cards, a half-eaten granola bar, a small digital camera. I picked up the camera and scrolled through the photos. Normal kid pictures, trees, his friend Timothy making faces, a squirrel. But the last few images made my blood freeze. The first showed Timothy pointing at something off camera, mouth open in what might have been excitement or fear. The next was blurry, as if taken while running. The third showed a shadow between distant trees, tall, wrong-shaped, too many angles. The final photo stopped my heart. It was a close-up of Austin's face, but reflected in something else's eye. A massive eye, easily the size of a dinner plate, with a pupil that wasn't quite round, and an iris that seemed to shift colors even in the static image. And in that reflection, I could see Austin's expression of absolute terror. "Find anything?" Macy called from the trailhead. I pocketed the camera. "I'm going to follow their trail. Keep everyone inside and lock the doors. It's just 2 lost kids, right? They probably just wandered off the path." I looked at the shredded backpack. The impossibly high ball cap. Probably. But lock the doors anyway. The boys' trail was easy to follow at first. Broken twigs, disturbed pine needles, small footprints in soft earth. But after a quarter mile, something changed. The footprints became scuffed, erratic, as if the children had started running. Then I found drag marks. Long gouges in the earth, leading away from the path toward a section of forest so dense the midday sun couldn't penetrate the canopy. And beside the drag marks, those same massive four-toed prints I'd found at the original scene. I followed the trail deeper into the trees. The temperature dropped noticeably, and my breath began to mist despite the warm day. The silence was total. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through pine needles. Just my footsteps and the sound of my own breathing, unnaturally loud in the dead air. That's when I heard the children singing. Faint, distant, but definitely children's voices. A song I didn't recognize, with a melody that seemed to twist back on itself. I followed the sound to a natural depression in the forest floor, like a shallow bowl carved from the earth. In the center of the depression sat Timothy and Austin. They were alive, unharmed, sitting cross-legged facing each other about 10 feet apart. Their eyes were closed and they sang in perfect harmony, that strange twisting melody that made my ears ache. But as I got closer, I realized their lips weren't moving. The singing came from somewhere else, from the trees around them, from the earth beneath them, from the air itself. "Boys," I called out. They didn't respond. Didn't even seem to hear me. I climbed down into the depression. The moment my feet touched the bottom, the singing stopped. Timothy and Austin opened their eyes in perfect unison and looked at me. But their expressions were wrong, too calm, too knowing for children their age. "Ranger Dale," Timothy said in a voice that didn't sound quite like his own. "You shouldn't have come here." "We tried to run," Austin added, his words precisely timed to continue Timothy's sentence. "But it caught us. It wants to show us something." "What does it want to show you?" They smiled identical smiles.
How to sing without mouths, how to see without eyes, how to be part of the forest forever.
Behind me, branches snapped. I spun around to see the creature standing at the rim of the depression. 7 feet tall, hairless skin gray-green like lichen, chest narrow but ribcage flared wide, its legs jointed wrong, angled forward at the knee so each step looked like a marionette yanked by cruel strings. The head seemed sunken between sloping shoulders, ears long and leathery, twitching independently. There were no eyes, only a ridged plate of bone above a slit of nostrils. Each hand ended in 4 hooked claws that clicked against one another as it flexed them. But it was the mouth that made me understand why the children's lips hadn't moved when they sang. The creature had no mouth of its own. Instead, dozens of smaller mouths dotted its throat and chest. Human mouths, child-sized, moving in silent synchronization. "The children are safe," it said. And the words came from all those mouths at once, creating a horrible harmony. They understand now. They want to stay. "Timothy, Austin, we're leaving, now." But when I looked back at the boys, they were gone. In their place sat 2 small trees, saplings that hadn't been there moments before. The bark was pale and smooth, almost flesh-like, and I could swear I saw faces in the grain, 2 young faces, peaceful and content. The creature laughed with a sound like wind through hollow bones. They chose to join the forest. Would you like to choose too? I raised my rifle and fired. The shot hit the creature square in the torso with a sound like a sledgehammer hitting wet bark. It staggered backward but drew no blood. Only a trickle of pale fluid that steamed on contact with air and smelled like copper pennies and rotting flowers. The creature tilted its head, bone plate catching the filtered sunlight. Those multiple mouths smiled in unison. Iron and fire. it said in that horrible chorus of children's voices. The old ways. But this forest is older than iron, older than fire. I backed toward the edge of the depression, keeping the rifle trained on it. What are you? I am what grows in the spaces between, what feeds on the lost and forgotten. I am the voice that calls from empty trails, the shadow that moves when you're not looking. It took a step forward, claws sinking deep into the earth, and I am hungry. Behind me, something rustled. I glanced back to see the two saplings growing visibly, expanding from seedlings to young trees in seconds. The faces in the bark became more distinct. Timothy and Austin, their features smoothing into the wood grain, eyes closed in what looked like peaceful sleep. My radio crackled. Dale, this is Macy. Something's wrong at the camp. The kids are. They're not acting right. I keyed the mic while keeping the creature in my peripheral vision. What do you mean? They're all singing the same song. They won't stop, and they won't open their eyes. It's like they're sleepwalking but standing up. The creature laughed. The song spreads. Soon all the little ones will join the forest. And then their teachers. And then... I fired again, this time aiming for the bone plate. The bullet sparked off the hard surface, but the creature stumbled. For just a moment, its form seemed to flicker, becoming translucent. Through its body, I could see more shapes moving in the deeper woods, tall, wrong-angled shadows that had been waiting. There are more of you. We are one. We are many. We are the forest dreaming of hunger. I turned and ran. Behind me, that terrible harmony of children's voices rose in what might have been laughter or might have been song. The ground shook with heavy footsteps, not just the creature I'd been facing, but others, converging from all directions. I burst from the depression and raced through the trees toward camp. The forest seemed to shift around me, paths appearing and disappearing, familiar landmarks rearranging themselves. But my compass, miraculously, had started working again. I followed the needle north, toward the camp, toward the children who might already be lost. The dining hall came into view just as something massive crashed through the trees behind me. I reached the clearing as the creature, my creature, the first one, burst from the forest. In daylight, away from the shadow-twisted woods, it looked even more wrong. Its proportions hurt to examine directly, as if my brain refused to process what my eyes reported. It sniffed the air, head swiveling toward the dining hall where 30 children sat in rows, eyes closed, singing that awful twisting melody. Away from them, I shouted, firing again. This shot caught it in the shoulder, spinning it around. That pale fluid sprayed from the wound, hissing where it hit the ground and leaving dead spots in the grass. The creature straightened, fixed its bone plate on me, and charged. I dove sideways, rolled, felt claws brush my jacket. The picnic bench I'd been standing behind exploded in a shower of splinters. I scrambled to my feet and ran for the old fire watchtower that rose above the camp. The steel frame ladder rattled under my boots as I climbed. Behind me, claws scraped metal as the creature followed. I reached the observation deck and slammed the hatch, jamming a chair under the handle. The small room was square, windows on all sides, radio console, and a fuel storage locker. I tried the radio static, but then Macy's voice broke through. Dale? The children. They're walking toward the forest. All of them. I can't stop them. It's like they can't hear me. Through the windows, I could see them emerging from the dining hall. 30 11-year-olds walking in perfect formation. Still singing, eyes still closed. They moved toward the tree line where more shapes waited. Tall, wrong-angled figures that matched the creature climbing toward me. The hatch buckled inward with a savage impact. Then another. On the third hit, it gave way, clanging down the stairs. The gray-green form hauled itself through the opening, ribs expanding like bellows, claws hooking the floorboards. I opened the fuel locker and yanked out 2 small propane tanks. My hands shook as I duct-taped my last flare to the first tank's valve. Below, the children had reached the forest edge. The waiting creatures reached out with claws and tentacles and things that weren't quite either, drawing the singing children into the shadows between the trees. No, I whispered. The creature pivoted toward me, all those horrible mouths opening in anticipation. Join them, it said. Join the song. I twisted the valve until gas hissed, then crouched behind the desk with my rifle. Go to hell. I aimed at the flare and fired. The explosion filled the tiny room with orange flame and thunder. The windows blew out in a shower of glass and molten metal. The creature shrieked, a sound like tearing metal mixed with a child's scream as fire engulfed it. It staggered backward through the empty window frame and fell, crashing into the rocks 50 feet below. But as the flames consumed the lookout around me, I saw something that made my heart sink. The children were gone, vanished into the forest with their new guardians. All 30 of them, led away by creatures that shouldn't exist to join a song that should never be sung. I rappelled down the emergency ladder, boots melting on the descent. The tower collapsed behind me in a pillar of flame and smoke. Where the creature had fallen, I found only a charred crater and one blackened claw, still twitching like a dying spider. The forest had gone quiet again. Even the fire made no sound as it consumed the tower, and in that silence, faint but unmistakable, I could hear children singing. They found me 3 hours later, sitting in my truck beside the smoking ruins of the watchtower. The volunteer fire department had seen the smoke from town. When they asked what happened, I told them there'd been an electrical fire in the old equipment. Macy Reed was in shock, kept saying the children had simply vanished. One moment they were in the dining hall, the next they were gone. No signs of struggle, no footprints leading away from the building. The search teams found nothing. 30 kids disappeared without a trace. The state police questioned me until sunset. They bagged the creature's claw in triple evidence sacks. Wildlife officers joked it would turn out to be a black market bear paw. Nobody laughed when the claw kept flexing inside the cooler, slow as drifting kelp. They took it to the regional lab for analysis. The courier's van crashed 20 miles east. Driver missing. Cargo hold empty. Skid marks suggested the driver had swerved to avoid something in the road, but the only thing investigators found was a large scorch mark on the asphalt and dozens of small holes like something with very sharp claws had been dancing. James's body was never found. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead, victim of a mountain accident. I knew better. Somewhere in those woods, in the spaces between the trees where geometry doesn't work quite right, James had become part of something larger and hungrier than himself. The search for the children continued for weeks. Helicopters with thermal imaging found nothing. Search dogs lost the scent at the tree line and refused to go further, whimpering and backing away from trails they'd followed countless times before. The FBI brought in their best trackers, who emerged from the forest hours later, pale and shaking, reporting equipment malfunctions and strange radio interference. After a month, the camp closed permanently. The dining hall was demolished, the cabins bulldozed, the whole site seeded with fast-growing grass. The official story was budget cuts and safety concerns about aging infrastructure. The truth was that no one could stand to be there after dark, when you could hear faint singing coming from the forest. I kept working as a ranger for another year, but I was different. Jumpy. I'd freeze at unexpected sounds, spin around at movements in my peripheral vision that turned out to be nothing but shadows. My supervisor recommended therapy. The therapist prescribed medication for anxiety and PTSD. Neither helped with the dreams. Every night, I dreamed of empty eye sockets that see through sound, of claws drumming Morse code on steel, of children humming off-key while something tall and blind triangulates each note. I dreamed of Timothy and Austin, their faces smooth and peaceful in tree bark, roots drinking deep from soil that had never been meant for growing. But the worst dreams were the ones where I could hear James calling my name from deep in the forest, his voice getting closer each night. I quit the Forest Service in the spring of 2014, moved to Phoenix, Arizona, where the trees are few and far between, and nothing grows tall enough to cast the kind of shadows that move when you're not looking. I got a job with airport security, good pay, climate-controlled environment, lots of artificial light. For a while, I thought I'd escaped. Then I started noticing things. The way certain passengers moved through the terminal, just slightly wrong. Joints bending at impossible angles under their clothes. How sometimes, late at night when the airport was nearly empty, I'd hear children singing in the echoing corridors that same twisting melody, just at the edge of hearing. Last week, I found claw marks scored deep into the metal walls of a maintenance tunnel. 4 parallel gouges, too large for any animal that should exist at this elevation, in this climate. When I reported it, my supervisor said it was probably damage from construction equipment. But construction equipment doesn't leave organic residue, and it certainly doesn't leave the sweet rotting smell of flowers left too long in standing water. Yesterday I got a call from a park ranger in Colorado. Missing hikers in the Rockies, he said. Strange tracks. Radio interference. Children from a nearby summer camp reporting nightmares about singing trees. He'd found my name in some old Forest Service reports, and wanted to know if I'd ever seen anything like what he was describing. I hung up without answering. But tonight, as I write this, I can hear it through my apartment walls. Faint, distant, but getting closer. Children singing that awful harmony, and underneath it the sound of something with very long claws tapping against glass. It found me. The song is spreading, just like the creature said it would, moving from forest to forest, state to state, carried by things that were once human and are now something more and less than that. The trees remember the song, and they teach it to new children, new victims who think they're just on camping trips or nature walks or outdoor education programs. I know what I have to do. There's a gas station down the street that sells road flares and camping fuel. My old service revolver is in the bedroom closet, cleaned and loaded. If I move fast, I might be able to stop it before it adds my voice to its chorus. But I'm afraid it's already too late. The singing is getting louder, and when I look out my window, I can see shadows moving between the parking lot light poles. Tall, wrong-angled shapes that cast reflections on the pavement that don't match their forms. Morning always wakes me from the dreams, but sleep leaves one question branded behind my eyelids. If light heard it, where has it gone now that night is everywhere? The answer is simple and terrible. It learned. Final report of Dale Hutchins. Found in his apartment following his disappearance. Phoenix police noted unusual damage to the windows and walls, including what appeared to be claw marks scored deep into the concrete. No body was ever recovered. The apartment building was demolished 3 months later following reports of structural instabilities and persistent complaints about strange sounds in the walls.